Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Murasaki in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 51, of Brothers and Letters. Walls draped in decadence, noises in the gloam, sky alight in the final lights from the day's sun, carmine, gentle, dismal. He turned his weary eyes and looked upon the sky as pallid light came in through the window, barred with wooden slats, nailed up tightly in a clumsy manner, the only window in the large room. It was like the one in an old jail cell, visited frequently by a haggard prisoner, a promise of hope and freedom which still lived in him. He did not like it. Far from home, his heart and mind were elsewhere. They wandered, one despondent and the other wondering, forever wondering. Unwillingly, he embraced the possibility that this would not end soon. A half-resigned, half-contemptuous expression appeared on his visage, and the obedient eyes mirrored it perfectly, tainting themselves in an easy passion that was a habit to him now. They tore open the rifts in the old walls beneath his feet, saw through the barriers, and the whole building filled with gloomy and bright colors, a warm canvas painted out by his eyes. It was not the same, it truly was not the same. A deep sigh moved his breast, and forceful memories and uncontrollable surges came to his mind, a determined seductress with a phial of poison in her hand. He could not escape the visions that beckoned, sleeping and stirring in his sherry non. There, in the darkness, in the cast of moving shadows and piece of enduring lights, sat his father by a single lantern. It was old, the same one he had always used. He never understood why. It once had a bright red color, but, now, the paper was worn out and old. The light that struggled to make it through was bleak. His father's back was to the door, and he did not see him standing close to the set of drawers by the paper screen. It was rude to not make his presence known, but he was curious, fascinated by his father. He was poisoning himself with a senbon again. He did not understand. He was a small child who had seen, with eyes pure and young, the troubling changes of but 5 seasons. It was autumn now and moths were abundant. He put his uneasy fingers on the door and his father heard him stir. He looked over his shoulder, eyes fires on his face, eerie, but he did not look angry. There was this softer light, hovering brighter over his eyes as his small body filled his vision, and a smile crept over his lips like a sweet tremble. It was as though his sober eyes were beckoning him. There was beautiful light in them, and it was a disarming kind of light that touched his small heart, and it reacted in him. His feet moved tentatively on the tatami mat, his curious eyes locked to his and his mouth curled in anticipation. He sat down beside Fugaku and he placed a hand on his head and stroked his hair. His father told him then that this was the poison from the glands, located in the abdomen of the autumn moth. It was similar to the Dufour's gland, only without the sting apparatus. It was like a little magic trick, and it only released toxins through fine hairs when it mated. His father did not say it exactly like that. He had spoken, playing with pink moths around the purple lilies in the height of autumn. He said that the poison went deep into the pink moth's skin, attacking its organs, and it died a slow, agonizing death. It was his first time hearing something like that. How could a drop of something so little could be so deadly? He was nearly beside himself with curiosity, a child's curiosity. He had taken a few deep breaths to get control of his building excitement and looked intently at the moth that lay dissected on the table. There was a cup of clear water beside it and 2 sharp senbons. It is easy to see the details with the sherry non, he spoke. See, Itake. Itake did not have a sherry non, but he leaned his head forward and widened his eyes and then narrowed them to focus. He blinked and widened his eyes again to take in the light from his father's old lantern. He could actually see the purple glands now, they were very tiny. Fugaku told him that it was not wise to take poison from inside the glands, it was too potent. That even the pink moth was not subjected to something that cruel and deadly. The few drops that clove round its glands were not that lethal to humans. They were filtered by the outer, fleshy layer. The real poison was somewhere beneath, and it had this dark purple color. Just like the lilies. And he told him how the poison in the moth's body grew potent when it fed on the enzyme and chakra from the lilies. It was fascinating. His father poisoned himself to fight the poisons of Kunao against Kunao? The sharp one won out in the end, it dulled the other's less sharp edge, corroded it. Yet what surprised him the most was the confession. His father had been taking it since he was but a boy of 6. He took a little twice a week. His powerful chakra fought against the vile assailant in his system. When he was a child, it gave him an aching fever, yet he would overcome it, rise anew like a boy turned immortal who had tasted something wonderful, like the lingering fear of death, only to be reborn as a new man, a new child. Over time, Fuyugaka grew used to it. It was the other soul inside him that ran together with his blood, a shadow, a man within man. Itaka did not know why he did it, but he did it regardless. Was it curiosity? Thrill? Stubbornness? He could not say, it was such a long time ago. He caught one the next day, took it into his room, did what his father had done. He arranged the apparatus for the task, a cup of clear water on the side, 2 clean senbons, and a cloth. He had a book of poisons open on the table. His cup was bigger than his father's and it had more water. It was there to dilute the poison. He realized that the poison was more effective if it was directly injected into the bloodstream with a senbon or a kunao. He had put the finger to his lips, pondering. If that was the right way to do things, then so be it. He pulled away the moth's wings, which had not yet attained a good purple shade, and they floated down to the mat, and unseen agony made it writhe and writhe whilst he cut open its squishy abdomen right in the middle with the senbon's tip and held it down with his forefinger and thumb. A sticky sort of purple goo seeped out, but Itaka did not need that. What he needed was the poison around the gland, or perhaps inside it. A strange, shuddering fear speared straight through his heart. His father had said that it was too potent. He had seen the moth feeding on the lily under dusk's gentleness, the glands were engorged upon its essence. Up close, they looked round and fleshy and shiny. Itaka gulped. He was only a small child, young and curious, and he, with a heart bold, cut the gland just a little. It expelled dark purple droplets, and when he bent his head down to take a whiff of it, he was surprised that it smelled sweet. Like lilies, but a little different, too. He did not understand. What an odd little moth. He stared at its tiny, round, glossy eyes as if he saw death's flavor in them. It was dead, growing stiff like a dry piece of wood on the table, rolling at his breath's mercy. He had to do it, and he had to do it soon. His heart decided, his mind decided, too, so he pushed the senbon deep into the gland, coating the tip with the tiniest of drops, and then he wound the cloth round his arm and watched as the veins swelled up. Fear and excitement raced up and down his spine, but he had already decided. He touched the surface of the water in the cup, and then he pricked his skin with the poison-coated tip of the senbon. A strange chill went about like frantic fish through his body, a deathly chill. He felt nothing at first, but as a tiny blood drop came out from his flickering vein, and when he saw the water turn deep purple there, he had known fear. That much color with just a little drop? That was the thought that had run against his mind like a slow knife. It was a hurting, staying fear, the kind that went into the heart and remained, found a home in the depths. A knife lodged deep into the chambers, and the shuddering pain and fear always remained. Always. At that moment, he saw an unending darkness and sensed immense pain and a soft feeling that whirled his blood in ways that he could not understand. He fainted. He did not know when his father found him, but he was not angry. There was remorse and sadness in his eyes as he looked upon him, something he had never seen before as he lay on the bed, suffering from a terrible life-sapping ague that ached and burnt in his veins as something sinister. Yet delicious, very delicious. He could only see a longing in his father's eyes, a longing for peace, for the return of rossiness in his plump cheeks. There was a faint shine in his father's young eyes, too, and they, in that anguished state, were ghostless mirrors of tears. There was a burning unease that pitted in his belly, and he moaned and sighed in distress, and his father wore worry upon his face then. The little darling, his little darling, how he wished to lift him from that cruel cradle. The memory passed like the pain, like the pleasure that was brief, foreign for a little body that had yet to know the aches of youth and speed of passions. Now, he stood by the set of drawers, a senbon in his hand. His grip was firm and that hand trembled with uncertainty no more. The moth was dead, a little dry husk on the wooden surface. He had caught it in a glass bottle days ago. The purple drop clung to the senbon's tip almost desperately. There was no cup of water to dilute it. He had outgrown those safe practices in his childhood. There was great addiction in this private pleasure thrill, an insidious sort of romance. Looking intently at the drop, Sherinan whirled in his eyes, and that familiar fast pace of his heart responded to the decision. It anticipated and released sudden vibrations, born of dread and joy. It was restless. He could say that he was, too. The vein pulsed and throbbed there, right there under the senbon's tip and its elongating shadow. It was a sweet little habit. Itaka jabbed the senbon into the vein, and the sensation exploded inside like hurting and pleasuring pulses. The shuddering spasm contracted the muscles of his white face. Red flooded his cheeks. Sweat beaded across his forehead and poured out of his body. His breaths came out quick and sharp, uneven, and unnatural for a man of unnatural control. The senbon dropped from his hand, and he clasped hold of his other shaking hand. He did not even hear the sound when it hit the floor. The affected vein turned deep purple, rose up, pulsed in his wrist. That poison, traveling as an enamored snake in his arm, spread into his body, exciting, hurting, granting him wondrous visions that he was otherwise blind to. The lock was a twisting snake upon the door. He wanted to close it, secure it, indulge in this pleasure to his heart's content, but it was too far for him to reach, and he stood on weak legs now. He stretched his hand slightly, but staggered like a clumsy toy and fell back supine on the futon behind him. Then his vision exploded into a tight ball of colors that would not blend. It was a strange, swirly kind of mixture that spun and spun, a pinwheel in the hand of a child that remained standing between autumn's song and winter's stillness, and sounds of sighs, laughter, wind's murmurs slid on him and shuddered as veils he could actually touch. The pain was immense, yet so was the pleasure. It was unthinkable. It was as though he was being dismantled and made anew. Every sinew, every fiber, every bone in his body vibrated in rhythm with their perverse machinations. It was a body wrought by a polluted spirit. Perhaps it always was. And his mind found its right pace for his condition, a chaotic scene of many memories, an ink blot that was the world, and then it spread and the mental template became a canvas of unending designs and colors, a shattered glass that broke into new pieces as the light from his eyes passed through their broken edges and became something more than a thing worthy of a fleeting glance. It became his world. Ah, a mundane little world, swirling fabrics, delirious panting, sheen of hot flesh that trembled with the want that was always a kind of habit. That perfect rhythm that twisted the limbs and made the muscles throb their protests, a lingering scent conquered by lily, lantern, incense, sandalwood, poison. And his vision saw the rabble of moths and their fluttering little wings like vibrations upon the air. Hands wandering the bodies. Thighs parted and the vulgar show of flesh and bodies. The careful spills. The hot sensation of a delicious abandonment that his body fired up, a burning flame spewed forth from the lips. It broke him, consumed him, and left him wanting, gasping for breaths. That perfect want. That perfect freedom. That perfect ache. He saw nothing but the endless oceans and their endless waves, and they crashed and crashed on him and the water smothered him, but it was painful, but it was sweet. What kind of paradox was this? His clever mind was left in a mess, and he was but a helpless child bereft of reason and logic. And he cast a delicate little net to catch delicate little things. And then his eyes wandered towards the door. The tricks, moonlight, and cracks and the rowdy crowd. The usual things, little things he did not want, and he cast that net again with a little piece of thought as his breaths tore from his spasming throat. His skin ached and the poison burnt in his veins like stabs from heated swords that had yet to be given a temper. A red taint issued forth from the walls, and he raised his hand and touched it and it rippled deliciously, a warning from his Sherinan, a throbbing slit of a harlot, a wound in the mother's heart, red and raw, wet and sugary. His teeth began to vibrate, and he burnt with lust's fever. His body was a crucible, and his spirit, a wanting and wispy mirage that filled that container, and an arch formed in his back. If she came to him now, he knew he would not be able to resist her. He knew he would have to snuff out the fire that raged in him, the fire he always put out in the company of Teos. It was just a little game, and he loved to play it, but this time, there was a new net and new memories. And then his sad little heart ached like that of a babe's, and he felt a veil form upon his eyes. Control. 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 Yet there was so little of it now. There was the smells of lily and old lantern and the fleeting aroma of sandalwood. The smells would not lift, and bits of his soul and mind were like children, bored of one task and set to the other. It was hopeless to catch and scold them. The little misfits. Leave them to their devices, he thought. It was a private place, his place. The red stain on the walls turned grim, and he looked into the eyes of a child, cradling that small face in his palms. It was the face of his father, his mother. And then it was his own, but the innocent bundle of bones and muscles changed some more, and it was Suzuki. The motions of lust impeded in these moments, and all that was left was emptiness and sadness and loneliness in the eyes of his mother, his father, and his little Suzuki, his little darling a bud shaking and in peril in the new wind. His lips began to tremble, and he did not know when it hitched his breath a little, and he put that palm over his eyes, shielding them from the world. Everything was the dark flames of his clan's eyes, hurting and burning little pieces of him. Then ache stabbed into his heart, his father's heart. It was a different ache, and fear and love and sadness fell from the wound, torn agape by his own hands, the mechanisms of his sad, little, unhinged mind. Itake, Fugaku's darling, the little babe in the cradle of his arms, lost somewhere in the depths of disennure and fears, drowning like the man gasping for the surface, but he was a babe no longer. Much was lost. Much. The feeling went away and so did the sounds, and his heart became a lonely sepulchre. He woke up to the room steeped in silence. A dark shroud lay upon the sky's visage and wind was cool. It was night and sun was gone. Another night. Another time. A sound came from the door and he listened. He was needed for the theatrical show in the hall. How foolish were these frivolities. He sat up, feeling his limbs ache and burn. It would pass. It always did. He took off his sweaty shirt and grabbed another one. His umbu jacket had to be worn, too. It was an official business, a serious business. When Itaka left the room and climbed down the stairs, the crowd had subsided into silence. The room was large and Kikyo had reserved a place for him on the cushion beside her. There was a smile in her eyes and red paint on her lips. It was a different kind of conquering and leering smile. Shadows danced across her white bosom and her face that was still painted in a customary show of a deft actress. He was silent. He said no words and none captured his tongue enough to make him slip. He walked, and then he sat down beside her. It was a show of dancers. They swayed and sighed. Prostitutes. They were here to name their price behind the sensuous movements of their limbs and back. They cringed on the floor there and bowed down, arching their backs. Then they raised their heads and rumps into the lordossus posture as though they wished to be mounted on the stage. Murmurs rose from the men sitting on his right. One of the overdressed fat one had his eyes set on the one wearing a red kimono. What had she set her gaze to? He could not say. Kikyo let out a girlish laugh beside him, fluttering her fan as though she was in heat, but, at that moment, something so peculiar happened. His eyes went to a man bowing to Kikyo from across the room. She whispered to him that he was a man working for her, but his chakra. It had a quick pattern the kind his little sibling had. And he slightly bent his head down and hid his face in the shadows. His eyes gained red, and he felt the smile touch his eyes, and it was a cold smile. Control. 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 He had all of it now. It was another night, another day was gone. The accursed crow. He hated the thought of being a little insect under its beak. It had pecked the freedom out of him, poked it out, and the innards of the last bits of his patience were falling out. It was a hopeless struggle. Why would it not disappear? The air sighed, a needy little thing that wanted the sun's warmth. Well, it was gone. The walk home was a lonely one. Naruto had not come by. Was he ill? He was sure that the seal would hold, but Karen had made no promises. Sakura. It had to be her. She had to be the snake devouring him. She was always an obsessed little thing. Reason was beyond her. She was a fool. He had little desire to taint his hands with another murder, but if she was involved in the designs of his demise, it was justice to pay her back. Suzuki cared little for her lust and desires. He was not obliged to indulge her. Her mentor. She always made it seem as though it was a moral dilemma to save himself from her insanity. How she looked at him wrong, as if he was a kind of madman who stayed cooped up in his home, playing with forbidden kinjutsu at the cost of many lives. Her accusations were subtle, yet absurd. It was another problem, another issue for him to bury. The thrill of child's play was gone, it was serious and deadly now. He never thought it would be so tough as he struggled day and night to fell his enemies, cut off greedy snakes sitting in his sleeves, like a gangrenous foot. The air was cold, but it felt fetid and hot. The wind held the tiny voices of his schemes. They were his little children babes with their own minds, but he had disciplined them. He was too stubborn to allow them an easy chance to play. The sounds of the chimes upon the door and the whistling that escaped the well drew him there. It was the same old path and the same old manner. Everything was the same, the cold and detached demeanor of his brother that remained, and the empty room of his parents. Gone. Just like that. Life was fragile. He breathed in deeply and stepped into the house. The crow cawed behind the main door, but he fastened the latch on the door. Tonight, he truly did not care for its prying nature. He took off his sandals and made his way to his own room. Sleep beckoned him. He had only made it halfway down the corridor when Rao spoke. "Suzuki, is that you?" He turned around and stepped into the sitting area. She sat there with her back stooped, eyes shining in the light like well-washed pearls, and a smile was on her aged face. "Oba-san, you haven't gone to bed?" he asked, looking at her curiously. "Nii-sama will be angry with me if he hears that I kept you awake. I told Tanaka to tell you that I'd be eating in the hall. I hope you aren't hungry. Did he make you dinner? Concerned about me, are you?" she asked and let out a laugh. Suzuki did not say anything, and in spite of himself, he smiled. "Come here. Put your head in my lap, and tell me what you did today," she spoke and tapped her hand lightly on her thigh. Quietly, he made his way around the table and sat down. Then he stretched his legs out and pressed his back to the mat-covered floor and placed his head on her lap. Rao moved her fingers through his hair, and he told her of all the mundane things he did today. How one of the foolish new ninjas in his team nearly blew up one of the trainee dogs of Inyazuka clan, and the grave injuries of one of his new medics. How the weather was a bit cold today. And how much he resented Ataka's unfair treatment of him, but he kept the secrets. He said no more than it was necessary. It was easy to make her happy. She was an old woman with an older heart. Rao bent her head down and placed kisses on his cheeks and forehead and lips. He felt that she always treated him like an unruly child. The little matter of tales was done. He said his good nights and led her to her room. She patted his head affectionately and went to sleep. He, too, made it to his room again. When he opened the door, the fire was lit and the room was warm, and there on the table was another scroll letter. He could tell it was from his sibling. Suzuki closed the door and sat down and stretched his feet to the fire. Then, even though he did not want to, he picked up the scroll from the table. He unrolled it and ran his eyes down the words. "Suzuki. In this time of autumn, I wonder if your heart is in the right place. Things are not always what they seem. Truths are elusive. You do not see things the way I do. It makes us different, yet it does not make us wrong. Oto-sama was the same. He was different than I. I was to him what you are to me, someone who is my own, but is different from the way I imagine things to be. Is it wrong to be different when I, the older one, have to be wiser, as well? Perhaps. I do not know. There are many things I do not know of. Your brother is not as perfect as you believe him to be. I, too, am a man of faults. What ails you? It may be strange to ask of you to pour out your heart to me. We all have our secrets, the little things we do not choose to share. I have them, as well. I would never be rude and unkind as to ask of you to bear such a burden, but you can still tell me of the things that anger you and cause you grief. You thought of him as someone who was distant to you, but that was not true. He was not a very expressive man. He hid his emotions. It was a sign of strength. It still is in our clan. We exhibit our emotions through visions. It is the way of things. I may question this notion, yet I will not change it. For your sake. Wars and the clan's burdens had made him hard. He was kind to you in his own way. The death of his brothers before you came into this world made him seem uncaring. I saw light in his eyes when he saw you the first time. He was happy. There was a smile upon his unyielding lips. When you used to lie down in the sitting room, he would stroke your hair and you would stir, thinking that it was me, or perhaps, Okasan, a callous hand that knew love. The strangeness of fatherhood and tenderness. That was all that there was in his gestures. He did not know how to be forthcoming. It was not in his nature. There are many things that are not a part of my nature, many things that are not a part of yours. We are different, but you are still my brother, and I will always care for you. Differences should never come between families. It destroys them. I have seen it with my own eyes. When I return, I want you to tell me what is in your heart, and I shall try to be someone you want me to be. I do not want you to slink away into darkness, with grief in your heart. Share your burdens so that it may lighten your spirits. I am offering this to you when this was something that was never offered to me. Take care of yourself and of your health. Autumn can be cold and cruel. Itake. The letter ended. There was nothing more to read. Suzuki tossed it into the fire. The scroll burnt, and then it was no more than floaty ashes in the fireplace. Itake's words hurt him. After all these years, why was he telling him of this now? He closed his eyes and breathed in deeply. His brother was such a liar. Chapter 52, A Grave Illness. Night, a pretty mistress, the kind that sighed and moaned between the soiled sheets but denied the wanting man any company. A bitter wind was blowing in from the north. It would take time for the cold fronts to envelop Konoha's skies and change the weather there, but winter was almost speaking. Autumn was nearly fearful of its slow awakening. Its designs had woken, and it would see to the life left behind in autumn's wake in a few graves. Winter would complete that happy reaping with unfriendly abandon. When sun deserted the sky at night, it became brittle, almost nasty. Here, the winds did not soothe, here, he felt alone. The early snow threatened his health. He was already a little fragile. His fever was in control, but it was not that his body had been given a chance to heal. The crows wrung out the last bits of his patience from him. This task was nothing more than an annoyance now. The official missives from Tsunade had no meaning, her succinct replies said little to soothe his worries. She stated that the matters were fine there in Konoha, yet, somehow, he felt that she was lying. It did not feel right. A seed from fear's bough had gone into his heart, and it sent out an unusual alarm every day, every hour, every moment. It was a kind of paranoia he had not felt in a long time. Suzuki. He left the wild child behind, left his watchful eyes behind his back to keep him out of trouble, but he knew it was not enough. Had he been given some time, he would have taken Suzuki with him to another city in the Fire Country for a few months. He had not taken a good leave in so long. It would have been enough to take the child's mind off this deadly game he willingly and happily became a part of. He needed a little time to be kind to Suzuki, let him know that he was not alone and that he did not need to win an unwinnable battle. As nothing he would do would undo the past. It was done. It was over. And he knew that, in the end, truth would cause his wild, unyielding, fiery heart more grief. It was still a child's heart that elated with an innocent vanity of winning games and grew resentful at losing them. Yes, he was still a child, a pure child. As a child, Suzuki would weep, and he did not know what to do then. The empty room of their parents terrified Suzuki. He used to sleep between them often, clinging to Mikoto's bosom in the nights, disturbed by storms. His forays into his room were always the playfulness of a child, yet when they were gone, he thought it necessary for Suzuki to sleep beside him. His new eyes became an ugly burden for them both. A deep sigh came from his breast, and he closed his eyes. Something in his mind expanded like the sky, and there, upon that black and bleak horizon, paranoia and omens met in an eerie way. Fear's ineradicable seed was sown deep into his heart, and he felt a tiny bud dig its way out from that untrodden soil, frantically. It was only a bud, a young bud. There was no need for it to flourish. He could cut off its head with a sickle and grant it a premature death, and then he would rest easy. Sleep easy. The night bird that was singing somewhere in the forest fell silent. It was quiet now. The quiet burrowed into his ears that now he heard a ringing like low-pitched sound. He had damaged some of the nerve hairs in his ear. A paper bomb went off near him when he was on a mission in his boyhood. The medics healed the superficial damage, but, by the time he noticed it, his entire auditory cortex had embraced this new pattern. It was irksome. He always needed a white noise to make him sleep. It was strange. He loved and craved silence and quiet, yet they had become his worst enemies. He always had the steady company of sounds to put his mind at ease, soft breathing of the child that slept in peace, drumming sound of rain, words from his father, stream in the garden, songs from Mikoto's lips, hot panting of a woman's breath. A smile's ghost rose to his lips as he stood in wait by the window for another song. The song rose and came to him again, and he was soothed. It was a delightful feeling of peace after the rattle of an unseen force. Kikyo laughed by his side, and he turned his eyes to look at her face. It was not painted as carefully as she usually did. It was painted like the face she wore in that warm winter's night. She turned her face and it came into the half-moon's light, cheeks hot, lips curled, eyes lustful. A gleam of the blade's shine flickered behind her back. A sword stand was set close to the wall. It was made to hold 3 good swords, but he could only see one. Her men had probably taken the rest. She looked at him intently, staring into his eyes as though she could see his scattered thoughts, and spoke as sweetly as she always did. "What's made you smile? I've never gazed on such a smile on your lips." He looked at her for a brief moment, a red shine flickering from his eyes. "Why did you not investigate your men's slaughter at the hands of bandits close to Konoha?" he asked, and she turned her face towards the dark, and it closed down on her face and bosom. The contours of her features were cast in shadows. "So unfair, Itake-sama," Kikyo said and put her hand delicately to her bosom. "You ask for many things in return for a little request. I just wanted to know what made you happy." And then she was smiling that bold smile of hers. "It is not a matter of fairness, but of principle," Itake spoke in a very cold voice and turned his head to look outside the open window again. This outpost sat atop a cliff. It was held there by seals, good woodwork, and many miracles. If he was honest with himself, the thought of it sliding down the cliff to get smashed onto the rocks gave him 3 uneasy nights. Itake heard her breathe deeply, and then she stepped closer. "You still don't trust me?" Kikyo asked in a sad voice he knew to be fake, and he turned his eyes slightly to bore his gaze into hers. She stepped closer still, and her body warmed. His Sherry-non saw it all, her blood's speed whilst it energized her veins like water in a tree's thirsty boughs. He chose silence, and his eyes went back to the forest and the shadows that slithered there round the trees, under the cliffs, in the black and waveless lake's waters. His ears wriggled, and a new sound mingled with the hum of the night birds and insects deep in the forest. It was a sound of steps. A knock came upon the door. He turned and spoke, "Come in, Karen." Karen stepped a little daintily into the room, barefooted like he. The wood was polished and clean, and her feet squeaked as she stopped by the fireplace. It was burning brightly. Cool shadows lay over half her face and the other half was illuminated by fire, her hair fire-struck and bright in the light. "The bandits got away," Karen said and took in a deep breath. "They were probably tipped off by someone. I think they erased their chakra. They know I'm a censor." Her gaze wandered from a faintly sly look on Itake's face to Kikyo's smiling eyes. "Troublesome bandits," Itake paused, sounding almost delighted, "always ahead of the game. They should be hired by the military as they are making fools of us all. Alas, the villages can be inflexible. Itake-sama, you should use your sensing to get them first in the mountains." Kikyo cut her off, hiding her face behind another red fan. She appeared to have a great stash of those. "My men have told me that they might be hiding close to rain this time. I don't take orders from you, woman," Karen said harshly, and her pink mouth vanished into a razor line. Kikyo let out a pleasant laugh, but she said nothing. "Tell Sarizawa to get the scrolls. We leave in 15 minutes, Itake spoke and watched as she bowed low and left the room in silence, after she pierced Kikyo with the fiercest glare. "Feisty, isn't she?" she asked, but it came out more like an accusation. "Did you take her to bed, too, Itake-sama?" "Good grief, no," he spoke tersely and there was no shade of humor on his features. He turned around and began to look at the forest again. Irritation came to her face, but she quickly overpowered it. "I was thinking that it's her that makes you happy here sometimes," she said, and her usually simpering voice was still laced with accusation. "You must love someone. We all do." And she said in a sweeter whisper this time. Her hand reached out to the bare tip of his shoulder, and she traced the path of warm blood in his vein with her fingers, feeling the healed wound there. "Tell me," she said, and slipped her fingers under the black glove and pulled it down. Then she pressed her lips to the skin above his elbow, waiting for some reaction, but still he did not stir, and she decided to speak again, more gently and more sweetly this time. "Who makes you happy? Is it the memories of your dead parents? I've heard that they were killed quite gruesomely. A belief? A woman? Or is it your brother? His smiles, laughs, just the sight of him that makes you happy? Tell me, Itaki-sama? You must love someone." Kikyo tilted her head, and her eyes traced the lines of his features cast in a perfect mold, bathed in the whitest shafts of moonlight. His face was without emotion. It did not seem that he felt anything for anyone. Even his eyes, veiled by long lashes, did not have any emotion in them. There was nothing there but an empty passion's deep color, and it made her shiver. He was a stone, and when she drew closer and pressed her bosom against his arm, he turned his face to look back at her. "What are you doing?" "I do not have time to play with you," Itaki spoke, and the glassy sheen of his red eyes filled with danger that did not disturb the rest of his face. Kikyo drew back quickly as though he was a flame that had burned her skin raw, but she grabbed hold of his hand and placed his glove and her fan on the table by the window. "Your mind and body, a meld of perfection, but your heart's black and cold," she said in a way as if she was set and hurt. Then she brought his fingers to her lips and took one into her mouth and bit its tip playfully, scraping it lightly with her teeth. "I did not allow you to come into my chamber, for I had a desire to dandle a child tonight," he spoke, and he sounded very distant. "Your intelligence reports are unsatisfactory. Do you want even to end this?" He bent his head and looked into her eyes. His face was hard this time as he pulled back his hand from her slackened grip. "You make it seem so dirty," she said a little heatedly, offended. "And why do you call me a child? It seems obscene to me that you allowed a woman to come near you, many times over, whom you believe to be a child." Her cheeks grew bright red, and her mouth drew down into a deep frown. "You behave like a girl child, yet you want to be treated like a woman?" he asked, and suddenly he looked amused in a manner as though he was mocking her. She breathed in and out deeply a few times, and then her mouth rebounded into another clever smile. "You're being unfair again," she said, and her tone cleverly changed to a forgiving one. She was such an actress, and he had seen it all. "Why don't you stay? I shall give you such pleasure." There was a full smile on her pretty face now, and she moved between him and the window. A sharp light cracked down on them from the sky, and a puff of air blew a hair across his cheek. She looked black in the shadows, but his Sherinon saw lovely colors in her heaving bosom and the sweat that oozed out from between her breasts. He had allowed himself to play with her many times in a span of 1 week. How many times had he lain with her? She always came to him in the dead of the night, sometimes when it was dawn, too, and he never sent her away. She was convenient, a willing woman in the waking poison's presence in his blood, yet it was more than that. She was also naive. She felt that these tricks would mold his heart for her, change his decision, a fool's seduction. It was a futile game, and he did not want to end this show of desperate passions. And she wanted to be touched in such girlish ways, and he obliged, for that was what it took to make her delirious, leave her panting and willing for more carnal meetings. She was so charmed that he did not think it was just the alliance that drew her to him with lusts in her heart. No, it was also pleasure, a deep, sinister pleasure, the kind that made her breath hitch, beaded her bosom, made her painted lips swell as they parted on moans without restraint in his chamber, a pleasure that was new to her body, a temple that lost its purity to an act of natural desecrations. She had ruined it herself, sweetly, or so a devout Hyuga woman would say, yet what was youth's temple without sacrilege? A boring place. Ugly passions, ugly things, pleas for intimate acts and timid touches, they never made his heart sway like a lover's. Kisses, lovely and little, he denied them. A light press of the lips to the moist seep of pleasure, a warm, chakra-infused breath against the aching emptiness. That was enough. He did it, for they were pleas from her lips, her sensuous body and its uncontrolled trembling. She was an easy girl. It was easy to please her, create an arch in her back. A paroxysmal excitement in the air. A shuddering in the limbs. A perilous lust. A desperate time. She had no idea what a fool she was. He had overestimated her at their first meeting. Itaka grabbed his glove from the table and turned away, a faint ire on his face. He sat down on the large futon and grabbed the sword from the side table and began to strap it to the back of his umbu jacket. Kikyo, looking a little wary, approached him again in a hesitant manner. She sat close to him but made no attempt to touch him in any way. The light of the lantern, sitting on the side table, made his red eyes gleam dangerously. He was a predator, ferocious in the dark, and she did not want to get hurt. She gulped once, unsure of herself, but quelled her fear enough to speak. "We're alike, you and I," she said with an uneasy hesitation, and to her surprise, his lips twitched as though he was about to laugh. The emotion passed so quickly from his face like a burst of light. She did not even get a chance to see it fully. "Are we?" he asked, giving her a sidelong look, whilst he counted the kunaus habitually. His face was expressionless again, though she could tell that he was very slightly amused. "Come now, Itaka-sama," she said, her manner of speaking perky, and she was not a very perky girl. "You don't think that's true?" He was silent. The shadows flickered on the side of his white cheek and the wall behind him. The red did not go from his eyes. The stain shone defiantly there. It was not going away, and it mesmerized her, made her very afraid of the dangerous game she was playing. "My father was a brute. He broke my mother's ankle once, stomped on it, broke the bone in two," she said, and when he looked at her impassively, she was smiling. "She couldn't walk for months, poor thing. I nursed her back to health. I loved her, you see, but my father loved me, cherished me like he knew no other." She widened her eyes as if it was an exciting children's tale. And she went on, "Love can be terrible. I never loved him, but he always told me that I was the light of his eyes, the warmth in his heart and soul. I was his everything, but I never felt the same. And when he died, I felt free, like my mother had been avenged of his cruelties. I thought of him as an adversary to overcome, to leave behind. His love didn't mean a thing to me. I thought he was a trickster." The light flashed into the room, and she saw his eyes again. They were still empty. She wanted to read something there to create a perfect net of deception, but it was hopeless for now. As shadow slivers traversed his face, she locked her eyes with his, feeling her bursting breast heave with lust and a tongueless longing. "Do you think it hurt him, Itaka-sama?" she asked and curled her fingers around his ungloved hand. "Do you think it hurts you the same?" Her words brought out little from his eyes. Amusement hovered above them, an ominous ghost. "Perhaps you should have asked him. Alas, he passed away." A missed opportunity, he spoke and smiled his habitual cold smile, eyes flashing from beneath his tar-black hair. "I am sure he will be sorely missed." That amused smile did not reveal itself again, it touched his eyes and vanished. "You hurt me," Kikyo said in a mellifluous, seductive tone. Then she climbed onto the futon and raised herself on her knees and parted her thighs as if she wanted to be taken in that posture. She stretched forth her thin, bony hand to his ungloved one again, grabbed it with a new strength in her fingers, and she placed it between her legs and stroked the inside of her thigh with his fingers. "You are insistent," Itaka spoke, a hint of displeasure in his usually expressionless voice. His fingers raked up her inner thighs, and the heel of his hand grazed the curls between her legs. "You would not leave this alone till you are not touched, would you? You are an irksome, needy little girl." Kikyo shuddered from the bitterness in his words and the feel of his fingers that felt hot and slippery on her genitals. A pretty color, like the first sake drops, spread on her cheeks, and she began to look inebriated. Her eyes trembled and she bent forward, leaning against him and dropping her head on his shoulder. She parted her thighs wider and wider, whispering, shuddering, a moist flood traveling down her thighs, her lips wet against his nape and they shook, too weak to plant any kisses there this time. She just whimpered, clinging to him, feeling him touch her there, around the flesh, on the flesh, in the tight flesh that wanted something to fill her more, fill her full. He had touched her there before at her behest, but she felt so desperate now. It was unfair of him to play hard to get all of a sudden when he had not denied her for many morns and nights. And a sudden tide filled her full now, and he felt a wild spray of her need on the palm of his hand. A shaking, weak breath came from her lips, and she fell back and he, too, pulled his hand away. "Stay here," she sighed out so meekly that it almost surprised him. This won't satisfy me. And her desire shone brightly from her eyes. He grabbed the corner of her kimono and wiped his hand clean on it. Then he grabbed his glove and left the room in silence, without looking behind at the dangerous anger that warped her lovely face in an ugly way. The night was calm. The storm that was coming this way had changed its direction. It went to the west to show its anger to another village, and he waited and waited for the man to bring him the scroll from Tsunade. He was getting weary of it all. If it did not have anything on it this time, he would have to rethink his part in Tsunade's quest for a full council control. He had not thrown in his kunao for this. Sarizawa brought the scroll with him from inside the office. It was a post office with mews in the back. Hawks and falcons came and went with the mail. Karen was sensing by the shrine that stood in the post office's shadow. What was Tsunade thinking sending it here like this? Read it. I am too weary for another missive that means little, Itaka commanded, looking at Karen who was busy with the task he had given her whilst she stood some 20 yards away. Sarizawa fumbled with the scroll, lowering his eyes. Itaka looked angry, in his own peculiar way. He unrolled it and read the details. They surprised him and he raised his eyes and looked at him with a sheepish expression. It's just like you said, Itaka-sama, he said, looking and sounding shocked. Cloud had hired her to investigate Danzo's ties with Mist in the past. A smile did not make his lips tremble this time. No, he felt it in his eyes. The irksome, needy little girl was predictable. Suijutsu stood beside him, wearing his customary ground-length cloak, chuckling. Next to him, Naruto looked downright whimsical. Everything was awash in gloomy colors, filtered into unkind tones. If it was not for the scene before Sasuke, today would have been another boring day. It was report day. The most hated day of the month. He loathed it with passion. It was tiresome to see his ninjas spar and write hours upon hours of lengthy recommendations, which he was certain his brother gave a single glance to and threw away in the dustbin under his table, with a sure smile on his sober face. He always had been a cruel perfectionist. But today was a little different. Today, he got to throw one weeping freeloader out, see Naruto's progress, and to his delight, he was close to making his new futon-infused raise-non with a single hand. It was something big for his friend, that and Hinata and Sakura were sparring. If only it was not so obscenely one-sided. If he had not stopped Sakura from using her Byakugo, she would have crushed the Hyuga girl into a thick red paste by now. Niji was dejected. Hinata was getting thrown around like a rag doll all over the place. She would swivel around and try and hit Sakura's chakra points, but it was a hopeless tactic. Speed was not on her side. Sakura was simply too fast for her. He had to admit, she had taken his criticism to heart that day and improved. She was faster, more dexterous this time. She was working hard to get into Umbu. All for the better. If she did not turn out to be the culprit, she would be out of Naruto's hair for good. The foolish romantic would focus on his own life and hone his talents for once. A whack resounded, the ground was crushed, Hinata went flying into trees and was knocked against a couple of thick branches. She fell down and struggled to get to her feet. Sakura looked happy. He would have to forward her Jonin application now. It was only fair. Yo wife's bane, savagely slapped like the rumpa, whore, Suijutsu said, chuckling. He was chewing on a straw clamped between his razor-sharp teeth. A disgusted expression rose to Naruto's face, and he looked to Sasuke. Sasuke, this man is vulgar, he said in a matter-of-fact voice. Tell me something new, Sasuke said and folded his arms across his breast. Ya could have chewed on her pussy some more, and she wouldn't have to join this bloody army. She ain't made for this life. It looks bleak for ER, mate. Am just sayin', he said and spat out the straw from his mouth. And I suppose you have the experience of tasting so many, he stopped, looking so offended as though he did not want to say the word, pussies. He almost choked out the word that it came out like a croak. He turned red as a tomato and sharply turned his head away. Suijutsu let out a loud laugh, and Sasuke sighed out. Suijutsu was at it again, Naruto was too straight-laced for this silly talk. Course I do. He said, with determination on his face, and slammed his fist into his breast as if he was about to give a speech of valor before the shinobis. We have a motto, lads. We? Sasuke asked, feigning surprise and emitted a chuckle. Even Naruto looked a little curious. No, the men from me mighty Hojiki clan. He said aloud and raised his hands into the air. We lads say, no muff too tough, we grow gills for the thrills. We called it, the Muff Divers Clan Association. Sasuke emitted a short bark of laughter behind his hands, his shoulders heaving, his cheeks growing so red. Naruto had an odd, baffled look on his face. He did not get a word of it. Yes, I've heard about you men, Sasuke said and wiped a hand across his eyes. That's why it went so fantastic with that cloud woman last year, no. Suijutsu's mouth hung open in shock, but he quickly regained his composure. So what if she whizzed on me? I've got meself a fetish. He said with utmost confidence and cocked his nose with an air of supercilious vanity as though this motto was a real thing. Naruto's eyes popped out. He could not believe what he was hearing. It sounded so dirty. Filthy. Vulgar. He loved Sakura-chan. He pleased her in many ways, but urine was where he drew the line. Sasuke, Naruto said and placed his hand on Sasuke's head, appearing very sincere, this man's spoiling you. If your brother finds out, he'll faint with shame. He'll be crazy mad, I swear it that you've been hanging around a guy who lets women piss on him. Think of his blood pressure. Then he made a thinking face. Does he have a blood pressure problem? The hell I am. Suijutsu yelled. I am the man he made me. Yeah, don't know the half af it, ya egg-headed goof. Before Naruto could say something, Hinata flew again to the left and hit another tree and fell down, but this time, she moved no more. Sasuke gazed at Neji, he looked disappointed. At least, she had defeated two Chunins on his team. She was ready for the next trial. His brother would have little on him to throw her out. He looked at the crow and created a smile as though Itaka was actually looking at him. Go to your wife and say few kind words to her, Sasuke said to Naruto, who suddenly looked very guilty and then gazed at Neji, who was helping her on her feet. She might need them from you this time. Naruto did not protest and slowly made his way to Hinata. Shock permeated her face, but she let him grab her hand for support. You approached him with the report from the infirmary. One of his men got injured a week ago on a mission. He was a young trainee medic. He fell down a tricky trap and suffered severe lacerations. His condition was stable now. He was relieved. The trainee was a talented boy of 14. He had right an affinity like him, and his chakra control was phenomenal for his age. He was thinking about making a good shinobi out of him, who would aid him in healing, as well. He would replace Sakura with him. The thought made him raise his eyes, and he saw her leaving the grounds all on her own. Sasuke followed her, with you in his wake. The sky rumbled, and a drizzle fell down on his warm face and it felt chilly on his skin. Where are you going? He finally asked, not wanting to pursue her foolishly any longer. Sakura stopped and turned around, surprised. I have to prepare a medicine for an Umbu soldier. Itaka-sama left me with the task, she said, her green eyes raking his face ferociously. I have a mission for you, he said, and a ripple of unwanted irritation crossed his face when he heard the crow caw behind him. The damned thing never left him alone. Stealing a glance at the red-eyed crow, Sakura returned her eyes to Sasuke's mildly troubled features. I'll do it after I'm done with the task, she said, and he heard a note of wild resentment in her voice. Then she turned around and walked away towards the densest fog that stood between the grounds and Leaf's narrow streets. Yu stepped forward and parted his lips to call out to her, but Sasuke put his arm in front of him. Let her go, Sasuke said and turned around to face him as he smiled, let her fly high. I'll drag her face first to the ground. This is the third time she's disobeyed me. She thinks I don't know all the rules, thinks she's so clever. Let Nii-sama come. Let's see if he lets her off this time. And then he walked back to the grounds, an angry glint in his eyes. Yu breathed in deeply. She was making things more difficult for herself. The steps back home were affected by a flood of thoughts. They were unsteady, shaky. She did not know why she was even doing all this. For whom? An unsteady breath made her heart answer. Her father? Her mother? Her Konoha? For Sasuke? Puffs of wind blew in her face. Winter was cold on the heels of autumn, and sakura flowers, almost dead. Few resilient ones adorned the dry branches. They, too, would perish in winter's rains. The winds would kill them. She did not know why, but the thought made her sad. The purple lilies remained and sakura wilted as it waited and waited for the pink moths to bring something of the lily back to her, but the impassioned pink moths always died, drawn to the cruel purple moths for pleasures fleeting. The sons survived and the daughters perished. Always. Sakura stopped by the gate of her house, hand squeezing the knot of cloth tightly. She looked down and saw a pink moth writhing pitifully by her sandals. It was dying. The show of death was cruel, her lips went dry and silent and torrential tears streamed from her green eyes, their white pools flecked with stings of pink pain and passion. She bent down and, with shaking fingers, picked it up from the ground. It fluttered and jumped into the air, its belly filled full with the purple poison. The color looked vulgar beneath the thin layer of pink, like something big and thick was buried there in a cruel ritual of coitus. She kept watching it till she could see it like this no longer, and she made a soft fist of her hand to hide it there and stepped into her house and called to her mother. She came running and took the cloth from her hand. Sakura went to her room first and placed the moth there on the low table by the purple lantern, thinking that, perhaps, the light of something it craved so much would soothe the pain of death. She made her way to her father's room. The old partition screen was folded there. It let in a faint, bleak kind of light she did not like. It struck her father's sleeping face, and he looked fragile and old, older than his years. This grave illness had left him hollow and frail. She sat down on the bed beside him and fed him the medicine made from the ingredients Danzo had procured for her. They were illegal in the Fire Country. Even the kinjutsus it required were not allowed here. Only few no-named nomadic villages grew these herbs. She had pleaded before Tsunade to get them for her, but she was bound by law. If Danzo had not offered her aid, her father would have died 2 years ago. Yet it was only prolonging the inevitable. Silently, Sakura got up, said some reassuring words to her mother, went to her own room. She locked it from the inside this time and slumped down beside the table. The moth was dead, it moved no more. It was as if its death had sapped the life from her body, too. A sudden feeling of loss gave her shudders in every fiber, and she grabbed the needle and punctured the dead moth's bulbous belly. The poison, as expected, had turned a little pink now, diluted and weakened by a weak defense mechanism of its own tiny body. It was by nature's design. She grabbed a file and positioned it underneath the moth and squeezed its belly a little. A few drops fell down. That was all she needed. Sakura put the stopper in the file and placed it in a wooden holder sitting on the table. It was half full, filled with a clear pink poison that was deadly. This one file of it was enough to kill a man. It was not as lethal as the one within the glands of the autumn moth. No, that one was much more sinister and evil. A little whiff of it was enough to induce a terrible, aching fever, and few of its deep purple drops killed a robust man in moments, but she knew that, if the right amount of this distilled pink one, which she had created by combining the essence from the lilies and pink moth's poison, went into the skin, it, too, could grant the affected man an excruciating death within minutes. If he were to survive its administration, he would wish he had not. She sighed, and then she started crying. She bent her head down as though she was trying to hide her shame again, watching as tears fell down on the shaking fists resting on her thighs. Suzuki. She whispered, and that name fell from her lips very suddenly, unbidden, raw with a visceral want that never failed to rattle her body. Why are you so cold to me? And her weeping grew in earnest as she raised her eyes and saw the hazy form of the moth through the shroud of painful tears. If he had embraced her, given her his love, she would have left her parents behind, left behind this loss that would be upon her in the future. Her eyes went back to the poison, and the tears stopped. The few of them that stubbornly clung to her pink cheeks made her skin itch. All he had to do was love her, and she would be free, free of everything, but he was not fair. He just was not fair. Chapter 53, The Crumbling Man. Blue eyes, lesser blues, that gazed up at the sky beyond the mist. His birth date was near, and as if a sudden, wild thought struck him, anger scurried across his face and lines creased his strained brow. What did that day mean to him now? He curled his fingers into a fist and clamped his other hand over it, eyes looking at Suzuki and the rest of the team. It was trials week, and the ground was reserved for their team at this time of the day. It was early morning, but the sky was so bleak that it felt as if dusk was an hour away. The mist was thick and heavy, and he could see nothing beyond the trees. Everything was bleak and shadow-like round the crooked branches there. The flowers were gone and raindrops clung to their rough tips, gleaming and shining in sparse lights. Hinata was practicing chakra control with Niji. She was trying to execute a successful 32 palms attack. She had improved, her footing and stance were better. She made quick stabs with her fingers, missed, and nearly landed face first into the mud. Niji had easily countered her. He was still too fast for her sluggish movements. Her cheeks got pink and hot. She had come a long way. How far had he come? In 5 years, he would admit, not that far. His eyes found Sakura's face. Autumn's heedless chill was not too unkind to her. She was teaching a trainee medic, a boy, how to expel chakra from his palms to close up the wounds. Pink hair was sticking to her pinker cheeks and raindrops glimmered on her lips. When she smiled, the droplets fell down on her bosom that was flushed like the most pink roses. Delicate like her body. She did not have the fullness of Hinata's breasts and the flare of her hips, yet he found her beautiful in her own way. She had smaller curves one would associate with athletic girls, not women. Her breasts were small, too small for women, like tiny buds on her bosom that had yet to flourish and discover the fullness of a woman's youth. The curve of her inner thighs was harder than Hinata's, much harder. There was strength in her legs, and her muscles were far more defined than a woman should have. Yet he did not care. She was a different woman, a new kind of woman. He had only been intimate with one harlot in his whole life before Hinata, a perky girl of 20. When he saw her nakedness the first time, his loins stirred violently. He had never so much as seen a naked breast, and seeing a bare woman offering herself to him with her thighs wide open was exhilarating, if anything. And he had jumped on her and forced her legs further apart. She never protested when he squeezed himself inside her. She was sopping wet, and he stroked her whilst she lay there, mewling as though she enjoyed the act. He could not say for sure, but he felt that it was the smell and taste of money Sasuke had given her that had made her horny, a pouch overflowing with gold coins. It was a birthday gift from Sasuke, and Naruto was too eager to accept it. When he lost his virtue, he considered himself a changed man. Sex was new, thrilling, delicious. The warm and tight feel of a woman's body was not something he could compare his own innocent touches to. His masturbations felt almost silly afterwards. The heat of being inside a woman was not the same, so when he was wedded to Hinata, he was just as overeager, and that tactless enthusiasm did not bode well for him. She winced and bled and cried. She was not wet and eager for him. He did not know which scents and tastes would make her flow like that harlot, he truly did not know. He could not grasp the details in the medic scrolls on intercourse, they were too clinical for his mind that was made for brute force. He was clueless, clumsy, too ashamed to ask Sasuke of anything. He knew it would humiliate him. Just thinking of speaking on this private affair bruised his ego. What would he have asked him? How to make his wife wet like that one prostitute he had slept with? It was shameful. And so, it went on and on like that till he got sick of her distance and her pain and her tears. He wanted soft sighs and softer moans, encouragement. He rediscovered them with Sakura. She told him what to do and how to touch her and where to touch her. She told him how she liked to be caressed and bedded. She loved to have her breasts be fondled by his tricky hands and tactless mouth. His exploratory ventures, tongue on the pink-tipped crests, elicited lovely breaths from her lips. When he had lain with her in warm days, hearing the sounds of the first spring rain outside the window, feeling the heat of her flesh against his, he knew he loved her. Her green eyes were the moors, not the empty moors where he had left behind Hinata, like the spring's moors where grass grew tall and lush and rustled wildly in wind, and sakura flowers tantalized the air. Her body became his world, his sanctuary. The scent of her between her legs was lovely and stirring. It roused him in ways that harlot never could. Hinata never could. It was beautiful, raw, musky like the scent of earth when it drank down the first spring rain, the aroma of wet flowers in the marsh. It was bewildering in a lovely way, and he never wanted to part with such a feeling. It was his to cherish, his to relish, his to love. His mind wandered again, and the road there tapered off to a tight street that ran like ruts, left by wagon tires between the filthy and cramped houses. It had been wandering often now. He dreamed foul dreams, places to where he fell, ran across the engulfing dark, with eyes watching, pursuing into the shadows. He was hearing faint voices whisper to him in the quiet days and loud nights. They whispered of evil and ominous things, and he was so wooed that he could not turn his ears away. That thing in the dark always slithered there, spewing its malice. Its mouth would lift and reveal razor-sharp teeth, and then it would snarl a challenge as though he was an adversary it needed to conquer. A shudder moved through his limbs and heart. He did not know what was happening to him. He looked to Suzuki, scratching his blonde hair. In his eyes, Sherinon slept. They were black, so black. It was a trait all Uchiha shared, and it always looked magnificent when the red consumed black, overcame it, a news from a wound fresh. He inhaled a cold breath, heart still racing. The Jonin trials were drawing near, yet he felt that he was behind. If he failed this, what would he do? He grimaced. A hateful thought went through his mind again, and that evil feeling from something sinister under his skin singed his heart. It jumped and roared for some moments before it found its nervous pace again. Thunder rattled and echoed twice, and he lifted his face to feel the drizzle on his cheeks. They grew pink and cold. His birthdate. He bent forward, rested his elbows on his knees, bowed his head as he gazed at the few yellow flowers, which still remained, dance and sway by his muddy sandals. They were tenacious. Sakura called them yellow poppies. Most of them perished in autumn, but some escaped deathly winter to survive for another season before they finally embraced death in spring, yet most perished, crushed between winter's beaks. A smile came to his face, and he felt it twist his lips. They were odd flowers, bright yellow and tiny. His eyes traced their stems and saw the manner in which they bounced back up again and again after being pelted by raindrops. They looked delicate, fragile, but they did not want to remain down. No, they rose back up over and over again. They were stubborn like he. Naruto, a voice spoke, and he raised his eyes to meet Suzuki's. They were still black and void of that color that was soothing and frightening at the same time. Suzuki was always the same. He was a moody man on his worst days. He was moodier who blew hot and cold at the tiniest of things these days. Itaki really had brought him up in the most bizarre ways. Yeah. Naruto said and wiped his face on his wet sleeve. How are you feeling? Suzuki asked, his face turning a little curious and wary. You don't look well. Do you have a fever? He moved his hand and placed it over Naruto's forehead. It was wet and cold. The Sherinon flickered in his eyes like embers in the fireplace, and Naruto felt bare before him. Shame rose in his breast. He did not want Suzuki to see everything, so he averted his gaze and began to look at the flowers again. They were still bouncing in the rain like excited children. I think so, he said, a little uncertainty in his voice. Then he scratched his hair again and grinned and turned his face up to Suzuki, who looked as serious as before. You look like you haven't slept a wink in weeks, he said and narrowed his eyes, his Sherinon weighing his half-lies and half-truths. Is Sakura keeping you awake at night? So demanding, your little mistress. And then he smiled, a mischievous smile this time, revealing his white teeth. Thunder roared and rolled over the grounds and wind made Suzuki squint his right eye. The Sherinon was still there, and Naruto felt his insides squirm in agitation at the sight of it. He let out a nervous laugh and wiped at his nose. No, you grouch, he said in a manner as if Suzuki's words amused him. Still clinging to the profitless life of a monk. He asked and watched Naruto frown childishly, his cheeks wearing his exasperation. Tell you what, next time we go outside the village, I'll buy you a good sancha. A common one for your best friend, eh? Naruto asked and rose to his feet faster than a bolt of lightning as though he wanted a fight. How about you get me a teu? Suzuki looked at him odd for a moment or two, and then a deep laugh rattled in his moon-white throat, his cheeks getting hot with the warm blood that rushed to his face. I can't afford them, Suzuki said, looking thoroughly amused. Ha, I knew it. You're a miser, Suzuki, he said loudly over the sound of wind. All good things for yourself and none for a poor man like me. Are you mad? They're expensive. I'll be giving away months' worth of my pays just to take a peek at their thighs, he said with a very sober face and started walking out of the grounds, with Naruto in his wake. He hurried forward to match Sasuke's pace, his sandals sloshing through the mud. We can share just you and me, he said excitedly and created this big smile on his face and smacked his fist into his other hand. Then his smile slowly faded and he frowned. That came out wrong. Sasuke shook his head and breathed out a long sigh. You can't share Teos, you fool. They only serve one customer at a time, he said and sniffed the air. It was chilly and redolent of dead leaves and rotten wood. Why does Ataka get all the good stuff? Cold, rich deviant. Naruto grumbled under his breath and then sneezed a couple of times. Cold weather never suited him. His runny nose turned bright red, and he wiped at it, like a clumsy genin kid, a couple of times, looking to the right and then to the left to make sure nobody saw him. What? Sasuke asked and stopped walking, and so did Naruto. He stared at Naruto, an irritated expression on his countenance. Stop talking about Ni-Isama's private affairs with me. It's sick you're sick. I didn't say anything, he mumbled indignantly by making a funny face and quickly looked away when Sasuke raised his eyebrows high enough that they disappeared behind the untrimmable hair flopping on his forehead. Right, you grouch, he stopped at the sound of a loud caw up in the tree. He craned his neck and squinted his eyes and tried his hardest to get a good look at the bird. Is that your brother's bird? He raised his curved hand, placed it against his forehead, stared up as though he was sitting in a ship's crow's nest to keep a lookout for danger. Figured it out just now? Sasuke asked and folded his arms across his breast. He watched as Naruto's mouth created a sheepish smile. Then he let out his habitual, sputtering chuckle and turned redder than before. Fine, I'm a dunce and you're smart. Happy? He said and raised his hands up, making a really serious face this time. The more things change, the more they stay the same, he said slowly, a smile on his lips, and started walking again. Why you stupid bastard! He yelled and took quick steps to match Sasuke's stride. Then he threw his arm around Sasuke's neck and pulled him close. Just borrow some money from your bother. Make that sad, miserable face like you always do. It melts most people, it'll melt Ataka faster. He jabbed his finger into the air and grinned with all his teeth peeking out. What's that in miserable face? He asked, with nothing but curiosity apparent on his face, and suddenly stopped to face Naruto. Naruto grabbed his shoulders. This sad face, he said, smiling, and then his mouth turned down to form a near-perfect bow, and he widened his eyes as much as he could that his blue eyes were like two foreign balls about to pop out of their sockets. What nonsense, Sasuke said incredulously, color tinting his cheeks in irritation. I don't make faces. Course you do. Naruto said, louder this time, and placed both of his hands on each side of Sasuke's face. I'm telling you, you don't always look good. His eyes widened in a manner as though he was still trying to imitate an expression. Knock it off, he said and pushed Naruto's hands away and turned around to look at the infirmary in the distance between a huddle of buildings, and he felt the wind hit his eyes and cheeks. The winds had turned colder. Why you think you look stupidly good looking all the time? Trust me, you make a really miserable sad face that only your brother can love, he said with a slight wave of his hand and nodded to himself. I'm not asking Ni-Isama for money. What's the matter with you? He asked and looked over his shoulder at Naruto, who was still grinning. You can. He'll listen. He took 2 bouncy steps forward and playfully jabbed his elbow into Sasuke's ribs. Yes, that would be a pleasant conversation. Ni-Isama, how was your day? Can you lend me some gold to root with Ateu? Oh, and lend some extra, too, so that Naruto can finally lose his unending virtue, he said with a fake smile. I've had sex, I didn't jump out of that pleasure quarters window. Stop accusing me of that, damn you. He bellowed and raised his customary shaking finger into the air like a disgruntled judge. The jury's out on that one, he shot back, smiling. Sasuke, I told you before, I'm a one-woman. His voice disappeared into a yelp, and he jumped a little when the bird landed on his shoulder to release another caw. Get away from me, you annoying bird. He flailed his arms about to scare it off. The crow flapped its wings and pecked at his head a couple of times. His hands shot up to protect his head as he shouted obscenities about bitch crows and cunt birds and squinted his eyes. Sasuke laughed. Naruto cracked his one eye open and found the crow sitting on Sasuke's right shoulder. It twisted its head a little to the left and then to the right, gazing into Sasuke's right eye, the shuriken whirling excitedly there. "This bird's as mean as Itake," Naruto said, patted his head a couple of times, and winched. "That shut you up about your monk stories," Sasuke said and smiled at the bird, and it cawed loudly in affection and suddenly fell silent, stretching its neck threateningly in Naruto's direction as though it did not enjoy his company. "I hate this damned bird," he grumbled through clenched teeth and followed Sasuke as he walked to a bench under the tree. He sat down, and the bird on his shoulder shook its body and fluffed out its feathers. Its tiny red eyes were still on Naruto, and the shurikens there made him shiver, made him know, made it remember. Naruto kept looking at the crow and an eerie darkness fell over his eyes. He swayed and fell forward, but Sasuke caught him. He helped him sit down on the bench and stared into his empty eyes. "Naruto, what's wrong?" he asked, but he was still looking at the bird, and the shuriken there was staring at him as if it could see his thoughts. He was naked, shamed, worn. He inhaled a deep and broken breath. "I don't know, Sasuke," and a shuddering spasm closed the sentence, and he could speak no more. He could think no more. Everything was gone. Only his shame, red in the crow's eyes, was left. He heard Sasuke move, and then he felt his cold, wet fingers on the back of his neck. He heard a little breath escape Sasuke's lips. Then Sasuke sat down beside him and clamped his hand on his shoulder, but Naruto's face was still working feverishly with an honest fear he had not seen in weeks. The seal. It was disappearing. "Come with me. You can stay in the guest room," he said softly, looking from Naruto's confused blue eyes, which continued to stare at the crow, to the odd manner in which the shurikens spun there like brilliant undying flames in the crow's head. "Your brother will allow it?" he asked in a sad voice that Sasuke felt a little pity for him. "I will. Talk to Nii-sama. He'll listen," he said, and his face was set in anger and defeat and shame. Naruto let out a dreamy laugh and blinked. "Last time, he asked you to stop pursuing Umbu in exchange for having me in your squad. I wonder what he'll ask you to give up this time, when he finds out that I'm just a madman who's barely keeping it together," he said, and created a bitter smile on his face that suddenly looked quite pallid. "I feel guilty. I was selfish. I wanted to be close to you, Sasuke. You're dear to me, our friendship's dear to me. You gave up your dream. I hope you forgive me." Faint red flecks appeared in his eyes, and tears trailed down his cheeks. He sniffed and wiped his face clean and let out a weary laugh. "I'm pathetic," he said, and tilted his head back to stare up, blinking his eyes rapidly as rain fell down on his face that exhibited defeat. "I've failed at everything. I'm not a good husband, I've failed Hinata. I'm not a good lover, I've failed Sakura. I'm a burden to her. I've shamed my parents, failed them, too. He did not say anything more and closed his eyes, but Sasuke's shuriken was sharp enough to see lines of chakra leave his eyes. He was still weeping. His eyes were red and sad now, and Sasuke did not know what to say to comfort him. "I've failed you, too, Sasuke, and I hate that the most," he said in anguish and opened his eyes to stare up at the sky again. It was cold to him today, cruel, but he was glad that it hid his shame if only a little. "I always fall back on you. I know you love your brother. He's dear to you. You may not say it, but I can see it in your eyes. They always glow when you talk about him, even when you are angry with him. Naruto, you don't need to." "No, let me say it," he said shakily and placed his hand on his breast and tried to settle his breaths into an even pattern. His heart pounded, but he found pieces of strength and courage to speak in the rain. "I shouldn't have done it. It was selfish. It wasn't right. Seeing you hurt like this hurts me. I keep asking favors from you, and you go against your brother. I don't want that anymore. I don't want to see you like this, hurting over things that don't matter. Naruto, he suddenly stopped and looked at Sakura as she appeared from behind the trees. At that moment, he felt anger's surge, but he stayed silent and looked back at Naruto, who was smiling at her. "Naruto, shall we leave?" she asked, her voice shy, and an innocent smile rose to Naruto's lips and his face changed. He looked happy, almost hypnotized. He stood up and Sasuke got to his feet, too. His hand was still on Naruto's shoulder, and Naruto turned his face to stare deep into his red eyes. It was as though he wanted to say so much. "I'm a small matter," Naruto whispered and placed his hand on Sasuke's shoulder and gave it a firm squeeze. "You shouldn't worry about me." And then he walked away with slow steps towards Sakura. Mist rose between them, a wall, and when light fell down upon Sasuke, shadows grew thickly about Sakura and Naruto. "Naruto, come with me." "You don't look well," Sasuke said with nigh elusive anxiousness in the tone of his voice, and Naruto stopped to look back, a firm smile on his weak lips. He had made up his mind. Naruto looked at him for a moment in silence and his smile widened. "Don't worry. I'll go to the infirmary. I'll see you tomorrow," he said and walked away with Sakura. Sasuke caught a glint in her eyes, and he did not like it at all. The matter on the grounds was done. He wasted no moment to do something about Sakura. She had to be stopped, so with an application scroll clutched firmly in one hand, he took firm steps up the stairs of the Hokage's office. The windows were closed and fogged. Fire burnt in the hearths in the hall. It was empty save two lowly grunt shinobis. His steps resounded in the emptiness, cut through the faint sounds of excited babble that came from beyond her office's thick door. He barged in and the room fell silent. Shizune stood by the table, a stack of scroll files in her hands, and another ninja he did not know stood on Tsunade's left, probably someone from her medic team. The smile on her face slowly faded. Tsunade took a quick sip of sake, and her cheeks instantly glowed with a robust hue. A smile curled her lips when she looked at him, but she did not say anything to mock the urgency in his face. He closed the door behind him and took few steps to place the scroll on the table that was cluttered with scrolls, 2 sake bottles, 3 different cups. She had even spilled some of it on the old scrolls. She was a clumsy drinker and a more clumsy woman. "I need to speak with you," he said, quite firmly, and then looked at Shizune and the other timid-looking female ninja to add, "privately." Tsunade drank down the cup full of sake and put it down on the table. Her brown eyes appraised him for a moment. She appeared to look faintly amused. She nodded to Shizune, and she left the room with the other shinobi. When the door clicked shut behind Sasuke, he brought his eyes back to the woman, and the Sharingan appeared in his eyes. It always did when there was faint distress and some thrill in his heart. "What is it this time, boy?" she asked and licked at her lips. She wanted to relish the taste that still lingered there. Her eyes twinkled, and she breathed out a satisfied sigh. "Naruto's ill," he began and clasped his hands behind his back. "I want him off the squad and sent home till he doesn't recover." Tsunade pressed her fingers to her lips and looked at him with the most suspicious look in her face. Her gaze roved on his young, rigid features for a moment, and then she looked at the scroll and picked it up from the table. There was silence in the room now. The wind outside was gaining strength, and the bare boughs, pressed close to the window, smacked themselves against the glass. She pulled in a breath and held it for a moment before letting it go in a sigh. "He's working hard for the Jonin post. I don't see how a little illness can be used to send him home now that he's so close," she said and rolled up the scroll, eyes still upon his face that became a little more rigid than before. "You aren't being fair to your friend. If he isn't sent home, he'll fail," he said, and there was a slight inflection that came into his voice. He was trying to control his anger. "Where is he? Why is he not here with you to request for a leave?" Tsunade asked, lacing her fingers together on the table. She was calm and met his eyes with a firm expression of authority. Sasuke sniffed the air, and his jaws clamped shut as though he wanted to shout at her for being a fool, but he forced himself to create a rude smile in its stead. "Despite my protests, he's run off to play with your student. I hear that it's a common habit of a mistress," Sasuke said with an air of disgust about him and a smile he had no intention to hide. She narrowed her brown eyes, and a quick anger came into face, only to go away again. "Get to the point, boy," she said, and her voice came out more like a hiss. "But she is the reason for his failures," he said and continued to smile, and she could see Ataka's ghost in him in his red, cunning eyes, his soft, beautiful face, his cold, serpent smile. Every feature there was blurred into a smear of childlike innocence. He looked young and pure that it was heartbreaking for her to see this frigidness permeate his skin and muscles like a theater show of make-believe specters, and despite his protests and angers and tricks, he imitated Itake. It was not hard to see. "You love to pin her with everything, don't you?" she asked slowly and watched, mesmerized, as the smile vanished from his face in a manner that had far less finesse and control than Itake possessed, but it truly was the same, the ghostly twitch of the lips, the slight squint of the eyes, and the flickering green vein that popped out on the side of his white jaw. Sasuke, the boy who loved to mimic his brother and who so adored his brother, his features had probably forgotten what he himself felt. No, they loved this act of mimicry, this act of wearing a ready-made facade, this act of love. His face was a ghost of his brother's visage. No, he really was Itake's ghost, a lovely ghost that was still little and naive and sweet, but the games, these cruel games, he played made him a strange canvas for his brother to fill. He always had been a boy left to craft himself at Itake's cold whims, and something about it was so tragic. "It's the truth," he said, and his tone quickened a bit in anger and stubbornness. "Your student is ruining him. Why do you let this go on? Sakura has nothing to do with. You know what's inside him." He cut her off in a harsh and grave voice this time as his Sharingan flashed and changed to take on a different pattern. They were petals, like that of a flower, spinning in his eyes as if being swept away by the winds, like pinwheels. "Don't think I don't know. I can see it, too. It's killing him. His seals are weakening, and I get the feeling that your student is behind this." Color flew from Tsunade's face. Her face and hands began to tremble, but she, too, had the experience and age to hide her emotions behind the tricks of her features. She rose to her feet and placed her hands on the table, her eyes looking into the odd pattern with a challenge she was not ready to lose. "And what is your proof for this accusation?" she asked, and her voice became hard and rough. To her surprise, he merely smiled, a kind of cool, habitual smile his brother always wore. "I'll get the proof, don't you worry, Hokage-sama," he said, his voice mellow, earnest, and his demeanor frightened her. He looked mischievous, devoid of any feelings for his teammate, but he never cared much for her when he grew older. He had left many things behind. Sakura was one of the many he discarded like a used-up toy. Though it existed upon his face like an unending farewell, his innocence was probably another toy he had little desire to pick back up again. That playtime was over, and she knew it was a thing of the past for this precocious and impish boy so coddled by his wicked older brother. He was just a naughty little boy-child in Itake's eyes. Tsunade breathed in deep and fast, anger consuming her heart and mind, but at that moment, steps sounded on the outside and the door swung open the next moment, and there in the door stood Minato. His expression was blank, but it turned curious and then suspicious when his eyes fell upon Sasuke looking over his shoulder at him. He could not clearly see the young Uchiha's face. He slowly closed the door and walked inside. His eyes, blue and beautiful, a gift Naruto had inherited from him. He stopped close to Sasuke and inhaled a great breath. He looked angry. "My son collapsed in the infirmary," he spoke, and he sounded frigid and distant. Shock came into Tsunade's pretty face. She steered her gaze from Sasuke's expressionless face and eyes bountiful and crimson to Minato's that worked in the kind of fury she had never seen before. "Did this happen just now?" she asked and made her way around the table to look clearly at Minato's countenance. The shadows had found their home along the lines of his face, it was a bit hazy in the dusk's lights. Minato did not answer her, instead, he turned a little and looked down at the, very slightly, shorter man before him, his features nodding in contempt and anger. "Have you been using your Sharingan on my son?" he asked, and Tsunade saw such hate in Minato's eyes that she did not think he had in him. Sasuke's face twisted in ferociousness, eyes flashed like fire, and he turned to face him. There was not an ounce of fear on his young face. He matched the hatred of the man before him. No, he beat it with his own contempt and arrogance. Light flashed into the room, and Tsunade could not believe how murderous Sasuke looked. Minato should not have said that. "What are you saying?" Sasuke asked, the fury in his voice apparent. It was a hissing voice that came from his lips. He was ready to avenge his clan here. At this single moment. He knew he would not care for Minato's blood or how it would dirty and stain the new mat. She, too, knew. My son has been getting ill and the Sherry Non is known to tame the demons, Minato accused again, and his blue eyes gleamed in anger. Another flash blinded her for a moment, yet the red in Suzuki's eyes shone through the haze, and she could see his face so clearly now, warped by fury and a murderous intent her eyes could not deny. How much did he know? Choose your next words wisely, Minato, he spoke brusquely, and his fine features worked into a thin, sneering smile that angered Minato even more. I won't allow you to insult my family for your own mistakes. You're paying for them with your shame. Embrace it. I doubt you deserved any less. Thunder crashed, and the new wooden floor beneath their feet shook. Minato's eyes did not leave his, and he could see malice in them. He felt as though Suzuki was avenging his own father by hurting his son. It was just, he felt, yet cruel. He could not fault the boy, but he could not bear the thought of his son suffering any longer at his devious hands. His eyes. They made Minato feel a delicious, slow fear that flowed unobstructed into his heart, and his soul was suddenly awash with its intensity. Yet he fought it. It did not matter if his father was a saint or sinner. It did not matter, only his son did. He loved him dearly, he was all he had. To lose him would mean he would have no future, and he had already lost a past in the wake of shame and mistakes and blunders. If he could save his son, it would be enough. So Minato narrowed his eyes that were two bluest oceans, and snuffed out that fear. Naruto was his son and he loved him, and that was enough. You are a scornful young boy, are you not? Whatever game you are playing, leave my son out of it. Or, I swear, you will be regretful. He spoke in a voice that was still laced with traces of bygone authority and raised his hand to point an accusing finger at him. I wonder if you were ever guilty when you chased after tulips in autumn mists, he said, and wore a clever smile, watching with detached amusement as Minato's features changed so suddenly. He was so shocked that he could not tame his features, could not smooth the lines to hide his treachery. You. Minato's voice trailed off, and he showed teeth in anger. What game are you playing? You treacherous, arrogant fool. Be silent, Suzuki. Tsunade cut across Suzuki loudly, and he sharply turned his angry gaze at her as though he did not like her interference. Leave my office now. And she saw his eyes alight with mischief, and his lips twist with a curl of delight, before he left her office in silence. Silence fell over the room, like a burden. Minato was breathing a bit heavily. His eyes were still on the door. At last, he brought his gaze upon her face and fixed her with a look that was no less angry than before. He looked at her for a few moments in silence, weighing his words, and then he spoke as his anger cooled down to something more endurable. I am taking my son home. He is ill. His seal is weak. I do not want him to perish for my mistakes. I will not repeat them again, but I will never sacrifice my son for the sake of Leaf. Not again. Never again. And he did not stay and left as quietly as he had come into her office. Tsunade leaned back against the table and put her hand to her bosom, listening to her heart beat loudly there. Tulips and mists. What did Suzuki mean by that? Stop treating me like I'm a child, Ryo, Kikyo spoke in a half-embarrassed, half-angry voice. I know what I want. You're still young. This matters beyond your understanding. Leave your sister be. And she fastened her eyes on the ruffled features of the young man before her. He was no older than 15, a fine, tall, and a slightly ungainly fellow. His angry face gave him an air of mighty anger, too much for his young age. I left you alone and this is what you did? He asked, anger flaring in his eyes that shone with scorn and fury. It was a matter of honor. You've shamed yourself, sister. Must you have me tell you that there's a line you shouldn't have crossed? The men are talking, women are talking, children are talking, everyone's talking. And he was breathing heavily with wide, ghastly eyes, and his young breast moved with haste to the rhythms of his fiery heart. She looked at him with deep attention as if he was an unexpected intruder and pressed her fan to her delicate lips. They folded on the paper there and she smiled. Come here, my little darling, she said, and placed the fan in her lap and stretched her arms out to embrace him. He did not move for a few moments as he stared at her in annoyance. At last, his features grew serene, and he let out a weary sigh, got up, and went to her. Then he sat down beside her and allowed her to clasp him in her delicate arms. She laid his cheek against her bosom, parted the messy shock of brown hair, and kissed his head a few times with heartfelt affection. "You shouldn't have done this," he said, and twisted his lips into a frown as if he had tasted something sour. "You shouldn't have done this. It'd give that fool and Shitji more reasons to lay dirt on you. You shouldn't have done this." And he was shaking his head in disappointment, his features becoming hard and sober that he began to look older than his years. He was still a delicate young man. Winter made him feel cold, and he hid in his room to escape it, often. He avoided the hills like the plague. The cold made it too hard to venture into the snow that whipped around the sparse villages there. They were men of the marsh wolves of summer. Winter was their death, it weakened them, but his young blood was too arrogant to accept it. "Must you always worry yourself?" Kikyo asked very sweetly and held his face in her palms. It was a different sweetness, free from the evils of Elat ions and poisons of passions, beautiful and free. And she bent her head a little to place kisses on his warm cheeks and forehead. "I worry for you," he said with visible emotion, and his eyes flickered with fear as he backed away to look upon her. "That man is a snake, a trickster. He can't be trusted. He became the commander of all military corps at the mere age of 18. That's unheard of. He's not an easy meal to swallow. Why do you treat him like a common adversary? Putting yourself in danger and," he stopped, biting his tongue, "getting intimate with him for an alliance? That's not what we agreed with that man. We agreed to stall him here and keep the scroll safe. He isn't even interested in your proposal." Ryo's eyes caught the lamp's light and they glimmered, hot and fiery. It was night, and the shadows stood tall. Kikyo smiled in response, and her smile was unabashedly wicked. "I adore his tricks," she said in a sinister tone, and it was like a serpent's voice in his young ears. "He's cold and distant and powerful. And so beautiful. It makes it thrilling to pin him down like a fish." And she laughed and the laughter rippled through his body. He did not like the sound of it. "You're being a fool." "He isn't a fish," Ryo warned, and his feature nodded up into another look of guarded fear. "He'll bite you, and I'll be left to clean up the mess. Make up your mind." Kikyo's face assumed a shocked expression. "Do you believe it to be easy?" "It isn't. I can't just offer him the scroll if he's hell-bent on refusing me." "That can't be done," she said and adjusted the delicate silk shawl draped around her shoulders. Her black hair was spread like silk strands on her skin. She tossed them back, and the beads dangling from the golden pins in her hair tinkled. Ryo slapped his hands on his knees and bent forward. "It isn't about the damned scroll. It's about you hanging yourself above a monster's mouth with nothing to gain," he snarled, and she looked taken aback by the sudden rise in his anger. "The man's dangerous. If your game of Sherry-non isn't working, we have nothing to gain from this, no light to gain to change its fate. Why can't you see the foolishness in this? I don't understand you." He looked down to his lap and rubbed his hands together. He was nervous. "Then I'll kill him in his sleep," she hissed, and the natural ruby of her cheeks showed up brighter against the light. "He shall die here, writhing on the sheets. His long white throat, I'll cut it deep. We must throw away the things we don't play with. He'll be the same, darling." And she placed her hand against his plump cheek and gave him a kiss on the forehead. A blinding light flashed into the room, and he saw her face tightened in a manner that made him fear for her. He wanted to say more, but as the sound and smell of rain filled the dark room, he chose to remain silent. Yet his silence did not stop the rain, did not stop the wails of wind and the roars of thunder, did not stop the stench from rising into the air and into the nostrils of the man in the forest. He wanted to turn away. The smell was harsh, penetrating, rotten, but he had seen worse and smelt worse. This was not new to him. With an air of firmness and a slow pace, he stalked forward, his feet sloshing through rain, blood, and bits and pieces of rotting corpses that littered the open space. They were lying there by the dozens, many of them had no heads and limbs. It was a macabre scene of ghoulish despair and a still sort of deathliness that hung there the way ghostless mirages of the dead would. He kept walking, leaving Karen and Sarizawa in his wake. Her pink eyes were wide, and she had her hand pressed to her nose. The stench was unbearable, even in rain. Sarizawa was silent, too, as his eyes traced the lines of broken faces and crooked lips after the swords, wielded by cruel hands, were through with them. Only their headbands glimmered defiantly in the flashes as if they had been stubborn to not let their foes' swords damage their artificial splendor. Itaka made a full stop when he came close to the only headband his Sherinon could see differently. He picked it out of the mud, and it shone with a different and coarse pattern compared to the fine lines of leaf and cloud etched into the metals so many wore on their foreheads with pride. Bandits. Convenient, he rasped as his eyes wore fury over the cold soul's depths. He shoved the headband into his pocket and turned away from the open graveyard that was free for the beaks of hungry scavengers. They had flown away when the rain came down. He knew they would be back again. These foolish men had been dead for 3 days, perhaps more. Send a letter to the Hokage, Itaka spoke and did not stop walking. We will leave for Konoha within a week. He kept walking away from them till he disappeared beyond the trees, and Serizawa could have sworn he saw murderous anger in his eyes that he had never seen before. He did not understand his words. How would they finish this business within a week? Serizawa looked back at the dead men once more and left with Karen for the next outpost. Chapter 54, Fathers at War. In the sunlight, his face was strangely white, almost sickly. His bright blue eyes had lost their shine in these past few days. He seemed weary, worn down by the burdens of his world. He had not spoken a single word and sat quietly. Somehow, dusk's glimmer was of more interest to him than anything else. Hayashi sat opposite him, his eyes roving towards the hole in the mat. It was still there, and he never had the time nor the money to fix his own troubles. It made him feel shame, but the clan came first, all else, an added burden. The shadow from the tree outside crawled slowly across Minato's face to envelop his cheek, and as if disturbed by its airy weight, he finally turned his eyes to meet Hayashi's. There was a strong determination in his eyes now. Hayashi did not know what had changed there. Minato breathed in loudly, adjusting the last vestiges of his old life, impressed upon the mighty vesture he had draped around his shoulders with care. Konoha's joy, but to him, it was besmeared with the past he wanted to forget for Jinu. He pulled in another deep breath, and he was suddenly reminiscent of a man who desired freedom and change. Hayashi did not like his demeanor. I believe now is the right time to end the marriage, Minato spoke, his voice surprisingly soft, but his words went into Hayashi's heart like a vengeful kami's spear. Hayashi's gray eyes shrank dangerously in his sockets as though he was a putrefying corpse in a lonely old grave where tongues of the dead and teeth of the critters were his only company. He did not say anything. His words were stolen by grief and poverty, even pride. He had last bits of it, hanging there from his heart that enjoyed few daily moments of vanity. Naruto has fallen ill again, he spoke heavily, steering his gaze again to look outside at the sun. He is also stubborn. I have tried. I truly have. It has been so long. It is time for us to let this go. You make it sound easy, Hayashi spoke in a strained voice, his teeth clenched. Anger was wringing his throat good. A muscle bulged in his jaw. He wanted to say something hurtful, but they were no longer young for quarrels. Age bent men down and drove such passions from them, it always did. The first roll of thunder hit the house hard, but Minato sat unflinching by the table. Hayashi's house looked old, paint was chipping off the walls in many rooms, mats were old, and the furniture, older still. There were many cracks and crevices his Byakugan could not even count. It was an arduous task for his eyes, and he had given up without another try. He had thought to mend the mat, at least, but everything ended long ago. It was a hopeless wish. It is easy, he breathed out, his shoulders drooping a little. There is no need to prolong this mess any longer. We are old men. We have seen the times change. We should be above this. And then he got to his feet slowly, wearing the advancing night's subtle shadow as the deep red of his past upon the robes faded beneath the hue of gray. Hayashi could only look on and say so little. Minato, I have been gathering evidence against Danzo. I can clear your name. You do not need to be hasty, he spoke, and his voice tapered off to a fearful whisper. He had thought that it would bring a change on Minato's hazy countenance, but he looked no less dejected as he did before. Minato raised his hand to his brow and wiped at the sweat quivering on his skin. It was a hard decision, even Hayashi could tell. Hayashi, I have grown weary of all this. It is time. Listen to me, you fool. He cut him off, and the tone of restlessness in his voice hung in the air like dust. Danzo offered more to Yagura than the Byakugans. I feel that he did something to trap Fugaku. I do not know why and I do not know how, but you bore the burden of a crime, and of faithless promises he made you keep. Do you not see? He is still playing you. Naruto's illness cannot be a coincidence. Why does it matter? He spoke and his words shocked Hayashi. The gray was flecked with anger and disbelief in his eyes. We have no proof to pin him with anything. Your evidence is empty words. No one will believe it. The council will do away with you as they did with me. You want to shred the last pieces of your honor with your own hands? Then you are a courageous man. I choose to be a coward now. Minato, he spoke, eyes widening, what has happened to you, my friend? You were never this defeated. Where is the strength in you I knew and admired? Children defeat you, he spoke, and a bitter smile trembled on his youthful face that bore the first signs of an aged man's face, defeated by demons that came relentless as terror from his past. Naruto has defeated me. I have nothing left in life if I lose him, too. He is my future, and I am willing to sacrifice my life, my ruined honor, for his sake. It is a fruitless battle, a thing of the past, and I have already lived through it. It is only a memory now. Hayashi narrowed his eyes against the light spilling out from the chink in the clouds. A cool breeze blew in through the slightly ajar door, and the peach-scented air delighted his senses for a moment. It was a small moment of distraction, and it faded too soon. He wanted to say something more, but his tongue was motionless in his mouth. He watched helplessly as Minato turned around, the last light of the sun illuminating his eyes like water under the full moon. He truly had such clear blue eyes. He stopped at the door and looked over his shoulder to speak, I will send you the gold Hinata deserves. You can keep the rest I offered. Consider it an apology from me, a friend. And then the garden's misshapen shadows crossed his form as a quick blur, and he left the room in silence. The firmament, a dark expanse of stars and clouds moon was a little shy tonight, but its sparse light shined down onto the balcony below them. His cunning Sharinon saw more than others, cut through more than others. There were tendrils of that quick chakra lingering in that room like a neat ravel of a harlot's hair. A masked man stepped out, and he saw his right hand twitching again with a curious uneasiness that amused him. A smile crawled with the hastiness of a snail on his lips, and he slightly turned his red eyes to look at the mischievous face of the Uzumaki girl he now thought to be far more useful than he had imagined. His child was more cunning than he had imagined, and the thought amused him more. Bright crimson flushed her cheeks, and she fondled the kunao rather suggestively in her hand. Her mannerisms were still quite delightful to watch. He had not disagreed with this notion yet. How many times have you used this seal? He asked, and she twisted her rose-shamed lips into a naughty smile. Itake-sama, you don't like surprises? Karen asked, pushing red strands from her eyes as wind raveled her long hair. He smiled. Sasuke is full of innocent surprises. I have learned to bear them, but I believe he has become an apt pupil of your funjutsu tricks by now. Surprises be damned, he spoke in a voice afflicted with a bit of amusement, and she let out a trill of laughter in reply. Do I amuse you? He stepped into the darkness, and redness issued forth from his eyes more magnificently, a sharp contrast between quarreling shades. There was concealed danger there, and her sensing made her heart suddenly quiver a little like a nervous note in a symphony. She really could not see his face clearly, but she continued to smile that lustful smile of hers. Though there was a faint hint of challenge there in her face, his keen eyes did not miss the innocent tricks befitting a child. Why do ask me? Don't you already know? Does my nervousness amuse you, Itake-sama? You can be playful when you want to be. Why not show me such a courtesy? Karen asked very softly and passed her teeth slowly over her plump lower lip in a manner as though she was seducing him. He found it rather endearing. A bell chinked in the tree that grew tall in the garden. Her face was full of a bright kind of chakra that whirled as a ferocious gyre about her breasts and genitals. She was in a mood to play with him, just to give Sasuke some footing. Her childlike designs were almost charming. Itake smiled and stepped out of the shadows. Moon was cruel to half his face, it was as white as a theater actor's mask now. Even the smile on his lips was unnatural, frosty and cunning like an actor's. Whistle when the moon is high. You can sing pretty songs, He spoke in a deep, calm voice like he was speaking to a child and bent his head a little, his red eyes penetrating her thoughts. There was a passing smile's hint on his lips, and his countenance mesmerized her. He was a strange man, and as she watched him walk down the corridor towards his own chamber, letting the walls bear the burden of his blacker shadow, she could not stop her words from coming out. "You wouldn't have found Suzuki that night if it wasn't for me," she burst out, and he stopped and half turned to look back at her. "I didn't do it for you, I did it to protect him." She let out a deep and raspy breath, her red cheeks covered in the sweat of fear and fury. She loathed him, he knew. Itaka tilted his head a little to the right as if he was observing her for the first time. Then he turned around, a smile's mirage forming on his shadow face, and left her standing in the corridor. When he opened the door to his chamber, a familiar scent of berries hit his senses hard. It was a little stronger than before, and it came from the cup she had placed on the table. The liquid was an intoxicating sake and something else. Obediently, Kikyo sat on his bed, legs folded beneath her thighs and a fan before her face. The lantern's bright light fought the darkness in the room and shone on the bed, making it seem that he was about to experience quite the performance from a theater prostitute before him. He pushed the door and it clanked shut. That metal lock on the thing was sturdy and made to protect the customers from the bandits. The smile was gone from his face, and Sherry-non had cooled off. It had become weary to enjoy this playtime, she was a dull lover to him now. "I was waiting for you," she said and smiled widely in a manner that he could tell was fake. "You cannot come in here as you please. It might become an irksome habit, and habits die hard," he spoke and took off his jacket. His face bore no signs of emotions for her eyes to watch and interpret, and it disappointed her again. "I came here with a proposal," Kikyo said and did not let the smile fade for his appraising eyes. "It might interest you. You press your luck again, no doubt." Itaka spoke with habitual indifference and placed his sword on the set of drawers. They were tall and hefty and had many drawers. He only used the top two. "It's about Shichi, Itaka-sama," she said, and there was a tiny bit of desperation in her voice that he easily sniffed out. "If we can use them in the alliance against the bandits, we might gain more ground. Wouldn't you agree? Your clan's affairs are your own. They do not concern me," he spoke and sat down on the futon. A shine emanated from his eyes, and she shuddered at the wintry kind of indifference he exhibited. Kikyo's lips curled, and she quickly changed her bitter smile into a seductive one. "Your eyes slay the winter, don't they?" "They're deathly cold on their own," Kikyo said, and a playfulness permeated her voice, and she looked at him and then the door playfully. She crawled on all fours towards the wall. Then she sat close to him and placed her hand delicately over the old wound again, like it always fascinated her. He crossed his legs and looked away from her to the window. In his half-prying eyes, Sherry-non slept whilst he tried to peer into the darkness that lay on the land beyond the open window. His silence prompted her to continue, "I know it isn't, but it's an alliance, isn't it? It'd be for the best if you gained their trust. They are your kin," he spoke, not looking back at her. "It is for the best if you extend a hand of friendship, not I." "So stubborn, Itaka-sama," she whispered close to his ear, her hand drifting down to rest on his thigh. "Why won't you do this thing for me? You'd be free of this mission's burden and the scroll can be yours without a price." And this time, her proposal made him turn his face. He looked at her, Sherry-non shining in his eyes, an amour who had revealed herself to her, and Kikyo stared deeply into Reds as though she was looking at them for the first time, mesmerized. "Nothing is free. Not even you. Your generosity." "Why? I feel indebted already," he spoke and she felt mocked. "Why not tell me what is in that scroll? You will save yourself the heartache and the unnecessary trips to my chamber in your future unfriended situation." A twinkling amusement vanished suddenly from his eyes, and her blush grew deeper in anger. "Your tongue is cruel," she said and locked her teeth to prevent any further retort. She bore the shadows he made, and her contours darkened beneath them, but his Sherry-non did not let anything hide, let alone the tails on an eager girl's face. "You should be used to all sorts of cruelties from me by now. You enjoy them with greedy relish, you silly girl," he spoke in a deep whisper and a strange smile forced itself upon his lips that refused to wear it in an act of mundane defiance that was their habit, and it surprised her. She touched her lips slowly with her fingertips to catch a gasp, heat flushing her body. "Is my tongue less cruel now?" he asked a bit softly, a ghostly delight apparent on his face as he brushed his fingers along the collar of her kimono as though he was doing it thoughtlessly, and the crests tightened and peaked there on her bosom in answer. "That dampness is not from the dream's lust, is it? You seek this out? Why do you play to be innocent, little Kikyo, when you can climb on my thighs and relieve yourself? I can allow you this courtesy, and we can speak of the scroll some other time." The smile was there no more, but his eyes were still different, steeped in a ferocious deep paint that was seductive in nature. Her hands went up, and she pulled her collars down, letting them slip down her shoulders and bosom. Then her hands went down and bunched the kimono there, and she raised herself up a little on her knees and lifted the expensive garment to her thighs. Itake moved his head back in a faint, misty light from the lantern flickered on Kikyo's face. She climbed on his lap and positioned her knees on either side of his waist, opening up her thighs wide. There was a silken thread in the damp curls on her genitals, and as he touched her there, he felt that any more was unnecessary. There was wetness at the junction, and she accepted him easily into her body. She bore down on him and pulled him in deeper, and then she thrust against him over and over again and clamped and pulsed around him in crazed pleasure. A continuous song of sighs and breaths issued forth from her lips, and in between that discordant tune, he heard a melodious whistling. Once, twice, thrice. The pesky rat was scampering away to the west. Itake rested a hand against her back, and his other one went up to pull a pin from her hair, and, without a warning, he jabbed it into a bundle of nerves at the back of her fragile neck. At that moment, she squeezed his organ so tempestuously hard, and he spilt a little inside her tight heat despite not wanting to. She sagged against him and breathed calmly. She had only wasted her breaths during the song. His arousal had thawed. He laid her down on the left side of the bed, then he picked up the things he needed and wore the things he needed quickly and jumped out of the window. The drop was a long one, and he showed a fast turn of speed when he found purchase on the steep and slick cliff and ran down upside down to the pebbles-covered ground that was a dry, stony graveyard at this time of the year. He landed gracefully on his feet, feeling the staying pleasure there in his body, begging liberation. He waited for a few minutes, and finally, Karen came running from beyond the lush bushes. Her face was red under the full moon's brightest light that swam into the lake's darkest parts. "He's still heading west," she said between loud pants. "The run was a hasty one." "I cannot create any more crows," he admitted and moved a little to the right, away from the darkness that seemed to almost grasp at him. "Is it a straight path?" Karen nodded and said, "So far, it seems straight." "He's fast. He's run past 10 kilometers now." She put her hand to her breast to feel her heart pound wildly. "Then I will have to run faster," he spoke and suddenly flickered to the right and vanished at a high speed. The darkness had let go of its hold on him with an unwilling whisper. There was no use tarrying around. She inhaled a deep and long breath and ran as fast as she could after him. It was like following something very small into the night's deep. He was moving so fast that her sensing could barely keep track of his movements. She could feel him drawing closer to Kyo with each breath, and then, he had gone ahead and surprised him. Kyo skidded to a halt and stumbled forward to catch his balance. He was a clumsy sensor, but one did not need to be an expert to feel a robust Uchiha man's powerful chakra. He fumbled with the sheath behind his back and pulled the sword out with awkward haste. Raiden ran over its edges. It was rough, but it made his blade sharp enough to cut into rock and bone. Itake appeared from midst the mass of shadows hanging between trees. A smile touched his eyes and slowly filled their depths, and they changed color, turning and transforming into his favorite toy, Sherry Non. Cold sweat kicked in, and Kyo moved slightly to the right and then to the left. He was impatient, and Itake could not help but smile fully at his behavior. "Why are you impatient, Kyo?" "I only want to speak with you," Itake spoke, and his voice was smooth like silk in a maker's hands. "I'm in a hurry, Itake-sama," he said in a rough and raspy voice as though he had swallowed a large soldier pill and it impeded his breathing, sweat trickling down his brow. "You'll have to forgive my impudence." "Unfortunate," he spoke, red dancing inside omens in his face. "I thought you could have taken me to the cloud emissary you were about to poison. That man is a fool. You can spare his family some heartache." Color bled out from Kyo's face, and he looked down to his feet as if it had spread out over the ground. What are you talking about? You smell like berries. Itaka cut across him and shrank his eyes shrewdly, a smile reappearing on his lips. It is a strong smell. The deep red ones, yes? They look lovely on a woman's lips sometimes. I do not see any color smeared on your lips. Is it a lovely surprise? I never took you for a catamite for the old aristocrats. Kyo's eyes widened and green veins prominently swelled in his neck with anger. His face turned deep red and murderous. You bastard! He shouted, spit flying from his mouth. He readied his weapon and pointed it at Itaka. All honorifics thrown away so soon. I was merely giving a facetious remark to lighten the mood. You are a very sensitive shinobi, he spoke and took a few steps towards him and watched as he stumbled back to find refuge between the trees. At that moment, Karen came into view from the right and Kyo's eyes brightened. He jumped back and stuck his feet to the bark with chakra and launched a measly cat-on attack at her that she was too slow to dodge. Itaka disappeared from his vision and Karen vanished the next moment. Kyo jumped off the tree and made a frantic dash to the cave's darkest mouth. He ran into the gullet of the cave and darkness swallowed him up. Fear pulsed in harmony with beating blood in his veins as he navigated the tunnels to reach his hideout. He had to make it to the flare and ignite it to alert Kikyo. Damn the sage! He should have taken his supplies with him last night. He tumbled into the room he had made, knocking the chair to the ground. Soft grass grew here and it was cushiony. Sensing a prickly unease, he twisted his neck to look back when a blur hit him, and he was thrown back against the wall. He flew across the ground and crashed into the stones poking out of the wall hard. His breath whooshed out of him, and he fell down to the ground, clenching his jaws together tightly. Few of his ribs were broken, he could feel it, and it hurt like a bitch. Kyo tried to scramble to his feet, but Itaka grabbed him by the jaws and lifted him up to his feet. His hand trembled whilst he struggled to reach for the stash of kunaus in the bag on his back. Go for that kunau again, and you will miss your hand dearly, he spoke, and his breath was like poison. Fear entered his veins so quickly that his mind went numb. Itaka threw him back again with such force that he fell back and bounced off the wall like a ragdoll, and this time, he felt that Itaka's grasp on his jaws was tighter, crueler. Loosen your grasp and drop that sword. I am warning you. Do not test my patience, Itaka warned, red filling Kyo's vision, and he could see nothing other than an endless shade and a blurry image of a young woman standing behind the red-eyed monster, and he screamed and blood oozed from his vision like a silent apology. Sit down, Itaka ordered and his grip slackened. He felt that Itaka had mocked him as he slumped down to ground without commanding his battered body, spit leaking from his mouth's corner. Karen looked at Itaka and noticed that he was smiling. From this angle, he looked very much like Sasuke, without the extra show of passions. His shadow fell heavy and hard on the man slumped before them, and it bore him down with its monstrous weight. Flames guttered on the candles' wicks and few of them had melted into generous pools of wax in the holes. Wax had dribbled down and dried up along the walls. This man never intended to return here again. Go and stand by the cave's mouth. I do not want any interferences here, Itaka spoke, and his voice was deeper in the cave. Not wishing to disobey this older one, Karen nodded and scampered away. A moment later, Sarizawa came running into the cave, his Sharingan glowing. The army has been led to the borders with my clone on your orders, Itaka-sama, he said, flicking Kyo a curious glance. I killed and burnt all the men who went with me. Wonderful, he spoke in a flat tone, without looking at Sarizawa, and Kyo could hear the foul taste of triumph in his voice. Your hospitality is lacking. He looked down at the chair that lay toppled over close to him. Sarizawa immediately put the chair back up on its legs. How kind of you, Sarizawa, he spoke, sat down, and slipped one leg over the other. Look at me and speak, Kyo the foolhardy shinobi from Cloud. He did not want to, he truly did not, but Itaka had caressed the words with his voice and tongue. They were cruel, yet sweet, and seductive. Now, Kyo was an obedient hound with a rope around his neck, and all he could do was obey, so he craned his flushed, defeated face at his tormentor and smiled in obedience. Kyo's eyes were unfocused and bleary. He only saw red in Itaka's eyes, nothing else. They beckoned him, and he wanted to reveal all of his secrets before him without a care in the world. Did you steal my umbu marking from the second drawer? Though I am curious, how did you open it without making any noise? That thing sticks, he spoke with a sudden flare of innocent curiosity in his face, and Kyo nodded and slurred out few words about oil and being a good mechanic, mundane stuff. Well, go on. We are patiently waiting for your words, he spoke, with an expression of encouragement, urging him to continue. I'm a cloud shinobi, he said, voice coarse and uncertain, his face looking confused and clammy. He was pouring out so much sweat. Itaka's genjutsu had given him a high fever in moments. Kikyo Shishi's bought men in Cloud. She gets money from her lands and some men in Konoha. I don't know who. I don't know who. I don't know. He lost his train of thought and mumbled and bled from his eyes again that the shadows and the red lines on his face made him look like an overworked court jester. Itaka-sama, your genjutsu. He might not. Do not interrupt, Serizawa, Itaka commanded, and Serizawa fell silent. He looked into Kyo's eyes, and he winced in pain that was spreading fast at the back of his head. Speak. I did not ask you to entertain me with your silence. Letting out a loud whine, he sniffled and coughed pitifully, and then he began again, a little faster than before, as though he was quite eager to please Itaka. She plans on killing shinobis from Sea Cloud through her uncle's Shichi forces and you, too, to sabotage the treaty. Reikage had asked her to investigate the assignation attempt on Kuma. He thinks Danzo was behind it, but he's grown suspicious of her activities. Thunder echoed through the cave and wind rushed inside, it smelt of damp earth and flowers outside. Kyo had fallen silent to breathe in the soothing wind. He took in short, broken breaths and screwed his eyes up tight and opened them, they were bloody. Itaka smiled in the momentary refuge of darkness. He was only a father at war with his wayward, wild son, but his son amused him often. Suzuki had covered his tracks well. His brother's games were so innocent, sweet, and, sometimes, they delighted him. The blame was on Danzo, and his name was clean. Clever child. She wants to take over Shichi, he choked out and coughed. She wants to rule all of the Okamai clan. She thinks it was her father's right. And you are her informant, he spoke, and Kyo flinched as if his words hurt him. Who is the snake in the bandits? After all, it is not possible for her to ambush them without control. They dance on her fingertips. She is a fool. Meru. He breathed out and fell back, exhausted. The genjutsu throttled his senses. He had no capacity to even weave a pleasant thought. Now, his mind was a container for the red oozing inwards through the cracks Itaka had made, with his Sharingan's sharp chisel. Itaka stood up, took a few steps, and looked down into his eyes. You are the one who will end this. And then his words trailed off, and he fell silent, his Sharingan blazing a flame in his eye. And Itaka poured a tale of murder into Kyo's fragile mind, and he took it as a word from the lips of the sage. Nothing was more divine than the honey that dripped from Itaka's tongue, saccharine, divine. In Kyo's mind, it was him and him alone. And everything else had vanished. The night bird's song buzzed and poured into her ears, and she woke up. The room swam into view, and she slowly sat up, and her eyes took stock of her surroundings. They fell upon the red there in the shadows. She sat up straight and adjusted her kimono, as if the nakedness shamed her, and peered into the dim yellow that limned his face. He was sitting in the chair, with the sword lying on his thighs. He was looking at her a bit keenly. The high of the pleasure hits you hard, Itaka remarked, and the expression on his face relaxed into a sly look that merely touched it like the lightest touch from a ghost. You can be crass and vulgar yourself sometimes, Kikyo replied, smoothing down the wrinkles in the fabric with an irritated expression. He had done something to her, though she did not know what. Her eyes wandered to the tea, but it had gone cold in the cup hours ago. He had not touched it. Do you pretend outrage whilst you stare longingly into the mirror every morning? I am surprised that you find your own antics abrasive and shocking, he spoke without a care and turned the sword in his hands so delicately as though it was carved out of glass. When she said nothing, he spoke again, do you want to continue this free spectacle for me, or can I retire for the night? It is your choice. Oh, so rude. She spat at him in anger and gathered her kimono with clumsy care and stormed out of the room, leaving the same strong scent of berries in her wake. Chapter 55, Death of a Crow. A butterfly flies with perilous wings. It shudders playfully whilst it sings, flying insistently towards the red. It made a little wound that bled. In the glare of that light, its mind was lost. It did not care for the terrible cost. Yet once it knew, it was too late. It had made a little blunder in haste. Poor thing, its wing caught fire. It died silently in the mire. She was always meant to eat her words like a thieving child ate his sweets. Her games were dull and instilled a sense of lethargy in him now. Other times, they grated on his nerves the way something big and heavy, made of metal, was dragged on the rocks. He was through with them and her superficial charms. They were theater performances one saw daily simply out of boredom. After that last order, Tsunade's missives came no more. It had been a week since he heard from her last. Kai sent him a letter last night that Suzuki was all right and that everything was going along smoothly. At least, his words gave him the reassurances he needed that his child was safe and that he had not made a foolish bargain to protect him. He would dim the scroll and every treacherous word spoken to him if it all came to naught. He never fought fruitless battles and never devised any blundering plans. Everything should yield results. Everything. That was his motto, so he never involved himself with anyone and in any situation where he lost. He saw things through to the end, played his games right, and made perfect plans to trap the prey. He cornered it from here and he cornered it from there, till it ran and ran, huffed and puffed in exhaustion, and was left vulnerable to the final strike that ended it at last. That was how his games reached their end, fitting symphonies for the journeys he had grown fond of. Yet he was no kami. He killed his foes, but he could never hurt Suzuki, a foe who shared his blood. He was never created to commit a sin this terrible. Suzuki, a fine paradox of his ideals, Kami crafted the child with care to mock him tenderly, innocently, repeatedly. Over the years, Suzuki had grown treacherous and moody and angry over the massacre of their clan. Itaka could not say he understood his passions, their deaths, a matter of the past. Why did the boy-child not look into the future? He asked himself this question often now, yet, as brilliant as he was, his mind was ill-equipped to solve this wonderful mystery. Itaka truly wished that he could breathe great sighs of relief, yet the precocious son, Suzuki, always pushed him about to be a little nervous. Itaka feared for the boy's life and that fear wrought delicious nightmares in his mind. Sherinan was a wild beast, and its glare created ominous dreams whilst he slept. Suzuki's wildness had made a silly man from him. He feared his own dreams, and they haunted him, relentless like ravenous crows that nipped at his heels for one juicy bite. The child, sweetly naive, did not listen, did not obey, and he was forced to recreate the rules of his own playtime over and over again. What a tiresome task it was! And it wore him down, and he did not know how to win this game anymore. Suzuki wanted nothing to do with his games. He was a child that kicked at the fragile temple Itaki had made meticulously out of sand and watched it sag to the ground in great amusement only to demand that he should be entertained some more. Itaki was at a loss. The rules of their games were so different. Suzuki took delight in the assumption that he could, someday, beat his older sibling at his own games. He was always like that even when he was a small child, and this wish amused him, sometimes, for it was endearing, so he tried to read him and he did the same. It was just a game to them both. Itaka wanted to give temper to his wild nature, and Suzuki, his defeat. Youth made wild men out of boys. A man's nature was a malleable piece of clay that was to be molded by youth's inexperienced hands that did not know any better, did not know the experience of patience through failures. A tale-telling heart needed the tales to weave and craft them in earnest. Perhaps he, too, needed time and patience to mold his brother, his son, his darling. His father had been clumsy in his spring, but he chose to learn things from him. He did not know what the future would yield for them both. Yet others were not Suzuki. When the rules did not concern the profundity of obsession and mercy, he was ruthless, remorseless, unkind. His foes chose to play and lost terribly. There were no aspects and demeanors to delight his senses, no smiles to fill his heart with wonder. Everything was crude and easy, the passions, quick and hot. He killed them, and his designs completed themselves perfectly, neatly, wonderfully. The perfect soldier, the perfect killer. It went along easily, and it was in his nature to be treacherous to Konoha's foes. He killed them, and they became new tales for his heart. It sang and danced in contentment at the thoughts that he had protected what he cherished. The passions came easy. They delighted him and made him ache with an abandonment that was no more than little acts of pleasures. Itachi was a man. He was no kami. He accepted it, touched the skin as it shuddered like the dried-up boughs in the less kind wind. They needed water to fill their depths, and so, he filled hers and relished the primal act every man enjoyed. There was a slight flutter of fingers against his throat, she so loved that part of him, and then, as if out of habit, she pricked his skin with the needle. Blood oozed out and sluggishly clung to his sweaty skin, then she smeared it there with her thumb, made it look like a butterfly's misshapen wing that had caught fire. He did not care. He had his own games to play. He did not have to break his rules for her. She was a fool and a foe and her time was short. So Itachi looked into her eyes, and they lighted with a new fire, a dangerous fire. She stared deeply, entranced by its beauty like a child. It was as if the moth's poison had imbued her body with a disease, and it shattered itself completely, feeling pain and pleasure, that the wall upon her mind crumbled, and he peeked into her thoughts with ease. Funny little, tricky little thing. It could not hide from the eyes of the beast. The red light trained on her, and her body was awash in a desire to squeeze him good, and so she did, and she was wild in the moments whilst she fought against the assault of death on her flesh temple and the prisoner spirit that everything in her shook at the unseen motion it had made in her direction. He spilt wantonly into her, savoring the way her body clutched him harder and harder. The more he probed, the harder she squeezed. It was like a game of quid pro quo, but he made all the rules. The irony almost delighted him. Then it was done just like that. The borrowed breath of life returned to her, and her body trembled in acknowledgement. She dragged in a loud breath, shaking beneath him like a puppeteer's doll pulled by the strings around his fingers, to give the audience an unreal show of what was real. A curious expression came to her face. She had erupted rather generously on the bed. She looked into his eyes again, trapped in the trance of a faint memory, but the red she saw was the ordinary red. It only looked back at her, and the beast she thought she saw was gone. Her mind was at ease, and she felt as though she had won a game on an empty reassurance. He pretended that he did not see the soul-chilling fear invade bits of her face and eyes, his body, a temple of feverish contentment after this satisfying eruption. She lived in a fool's paradise of her own making. Karen's seals were crafty and strange. Kikyo's guard felt the tremors of a foreign chakra in the worst possible ways. There was a rictus upon his face that was reserved for fools, and when his genjutsu struck his mind, he spilt out more words than necessary. Kikyo had all the rowdy bandits under her little thumb. It was a small army she had created when she was young. It grew and made more factions, and strangely, one faction did not know fully about the other. Their heads contacted each other through common birds and did the bidding of rich men willingly. Men that filled the lower ranks were slaughtered for bigger prices, and they remained blissfully unaware of the secret alliance between the heads. It was a cluster of fascinating lies. Their lives were of little value to Meru and his men. His group sat at the nexus of these scruffy hooligans he had gathered on her orders to prattle on about freedom and liberty. Kikyo was hell-bent on taking over Okamai clan through Sharingan's illusions. The foolish men in Shichi never had the luxury of Uzumaki seals she had stuffed into her sleeves. She must have got them cheap from Danzo, so her censors waited around, alert and vigilant in their pursuits, to detect an intrusion into their minds. Classic route. Classic Danzo. Itachi had little to lay on him, but he would have to be a child to not see reason in this logic. Danzo was protecting the scroll, and he simply wanted to keep him here. For what purpose? And that thought had filled his soul with poison, and he had chosen to be so callous to cut her down. She was not worth the trouble. If he waited around any longer, it would prove to be disastrous for him for Sasuke. It was not as if Tsunade was willing for a diplomatic solution. It was better this way. Now, he stood on the cliff's apex, looking down at the path that undulated through the forest for his eyes. A drizzle caressed his face and throat, the wounds she made there had healed. A small army of thugs stood by the trees, lying in wait to ambush him. This cluster of trees was meant to become a natural lid on their mass grave. Itaka flashed down fast and grabbed the man he thought to be their leader by his jaws. His fingers clawed, and he thrashed about violently, unable to free himself as got lifted off the ground. Itaka dislocated and crushed his jaws. The man fell down, and he appeared to have a puppet's wide and silly grin on his face. Karen gasped and watched, too horrified to look and too mesmerized to look away, as he cut, maimed, burnt men under the light touch of the sweetest rain she had experienced in a long time. The scent of it was defiled by his cruelty, and the ground glared with blood. Bodies crashed onto rocks and shattered like theater marionettes as she looked on. This was the darling brother Sasuke chose to mimic? Karen did not know what to feel about his decisions. Though exceptionally brilliant, Sasuke always had been a strange one. She loved him but also wanted him to free himself from Itaka's clutches, but it did not feel as though Sasuke wanted to twist away from the grip Itaka had on him, too blinded by his love for him. He was a babe in his brother's arms, and Itaka played with him out of love and a bizarre obsession that carried cruelty's taint. The father's perfect mask that he wore before his face was streaked with the most unkind shadows he dragged out with himself from the battlefield. His hands were decorated with the blood of fools and innocents. She did not wish for Sasuke to become like the older one, she did not. The battle was over quickly. In a matter of few minutes, he had laid waste to an army of 70 men. Karen sensed and felt nothing, so she took in the air, filled with blood's stench, and ran down. Itaka stood quietly over the man he had killed only moments ago. He was staring at his face like something there made him a little curious. She stopped and he turned around, and for a fleeting beat, she felt an intent, almost caustic, in him that made her stagger back. The feeling vanished, and his eyes cooled down like a fire going out without a hiss. He held out his sword under the forgiving rain and watched as the blood slipped down the sides and became food for the ground. These bodies would become a feast for all the scavengers in the morning. "Can you sense him?" Itaka asked and raised his sword to look at the gleam sliding on the perfect edges. It looked good as new. Sasuke had told her that Itaka sharpened it himself, often. She could tell that he liked the sharp sword the way a satisfied smile touched his resistant eyes. "No," Karen said, and sensed his chakra roil in his body without an emotion, a fire without heat. Her gaze wandered to the right to look at the cruel expressions frozen on the faces of the dead men. "Were you the reason Sasuke managed to kill Fu?" Itaka asked suddenly and stashed the sword away. Karen's heart beat louder. It had leapt up to vibrate inside her throat. Sarizawa appeared from the right, and she could smell the blood on his hands, yet his crimson-veiled eyes did not give her the reassurance she needed. She inhaled a cold breath and stared him right in the eye as though he did not scare her, though she knew that his Sharingan could see all of the tales in her child heart. "Sasuke bought my freedom," Karen said a little rudely, her cheeks going red in hurting fury. "I owe him everything and I owe you nothing. Why do you play games with me? You know what he did. You know you've always known." Then she was breathing hoarsely and looking deep into his eyes, with the carelessness of a child. And his smile surprised her. Anger washed away, and she looked around at the fabric of that sweet air inwrought with many red butterflies, slowly changing into autumn moths. Their wings become their fabric and purple mottled the red, a lingering disease. They fluttered about him, enthralled by the chakra he exuded. Then they vanished. "For how long do you want to play with him, knowing that he does not love you?" His gaze wandered her body as he appraised her worth. "You have a big heart for a hopeful little girl," he spoke in a way as if he mocked her and looked to Sarizawa with an authoritative expression upon his face now. The rain had granted him a little spring hue about the cheeks, to fashion a make-believe mask of an ordinary man for his face. He was no man, he was a monster. "I couldn't find Meru. He must have moved on to another outpost a day ago," he said, and a hint of shame appeared on his pink face. "You could not catch him fleeing? You continue to disappoint me, Sarizawa," he spoke, and there was a subtle note of irritation in his flat tone of voice, and Karen sensed a sudden flare of anxiety rise in Sarizawa's breast. He was afraid. He bowed his head and spoke no more. His Sharingan had crumbled beneath Itaka's harsh words. His limbs slightly shuddered, and he kept looking down towards his feet in a very servile manner. At that moment, a crow dragged itself out of Itaka's body. His eyes went wide. He stumbled forward, as if someone had harshly yanked him by the throat, and then slumped down onto his knees in dreadful pain and shock that invaded his body and mind like a deadly assailant. The poison. It burned up his veins. It hurt so much that he lost the natural capacity to pull in some air. Sarazawa rushed to him and grabbed him by the shoulders, but he did not move and shook helplessly all over. He stared, with wild eyes, at the crow that struggled to gain shape by his knee. It was premature and ugly foetus. Then Itaka looked at his trembling hands and the graying veins. His chakra had stopped for a moment, and now, it was frantically vibrating in him to find its right pace again. 1 moment passed, then 2, then 3, and he finally dragged in air by the lungfuls. His Sharingan flickered, vision betrayed him for a moment, but it recovered swiftly to look at the tiny chakra particles flow through his body again. He had neglected it for so long, far too long, that his body had decided to smooth out the chakra on its own. A man's body false and feeble, he truly was no kami. He watched as the slimy crow opened its beak wide like a hungry babe dragged out forcefully from a womb and looked at him with a deformed Sharingan, as if it thought him to be its creator, its mother. Its caw tore apart the air, filling its torn-up portions with a new dread, and he raised his eyes and stared almost impatiently at the one he had made before, only to watch it vanish in a bundle of wispy black feathers. His strained eyes followed the movements of each feather as they floated down one by one, turning into tendrils of bright chakra before they kissed the ground. Karen sat down beside him and pressed her wrist to his lips. He pushed it out of his face. This easy escape from torment did not interest him. He was so used to pain that he overwhelmed it, and it slowly mellowed to a dull ache that thrilled his body and spirit. And Itaki raised his defeated eyes again to look where the crow was only a moment ago, as though he could see Sasuke's sly smile as he flashed into the forest, leaving Kai to his own devices as he remained oblivious to the guard crow's fate. Then he uttered a low, soft whisper, nearly mourning the death of a lifeless crow, mourning the death of a child he had birthed. No. Itaka looked down at it again and it died, staring back into his eyes with the last mournful look of a dying babe that needed the merciful assurance from his eyes that something sweet-tasting and peace-giving awaited it beyond this life's fate, and he was speechless, for he did not know how to comfort a dying child. Check the description for the links to the author.